This page depicts the cover of the very first issue of N64 Magazine, dated April 1997. Right there at the top in big red letters it shouts, "New!" which was fair enough as it was issue 1 and all. It's clearly aimed squarely for Nintendo 64 fans, as if there was anyone else at the time. The main focus is obviously Mario, with a huge picture of his mug and the words "Mario Go! Go!" splashed across the page in yellow and blue. They're banging on about Super Mario 64 reviewed, rated, and completed, which was the big draw, wasn't it? Everyone was desperate to know if it lived up to the hype and whether they actually finished it properly, given how massive that game was. Then there's Turok up there in red, claiming it's pure dynamite, which, alright, bit cheesy, but Turok was supposed to be the proper grown-up shooter on the N64, dinosaurs and all that. Down at the bottom they've crammed in little boxes for other games, mentioning StarFox 64, Zelda 64, Perfect Striker, and a huge Mario Kart 64 review, so they're covering all the bases for the launch lineup really. Warrington Knockers. And they even have a bit about Japanese and US news and reviews. Warrington Knockers. Remember those days? Before the internet was everywhere, magazines like this were your only window into what was happening in gaming overseas. Mad to think of it now. Issue 1, proper retro stuff. This page from N64 Magazine, April 97, is all about hyping up their new mag, right when the N64 was hitting the shelves. It's got a big picture of the console itself, you know, that chunky grey beast with the colourful logo on top. Always looked a bit like a toy, didn't it? Tay. Above it there's a bit of chat like it's the console talking to the magazine, a bit cheesy really, saying morning. Not too bad thanks. And she, hello, what's this poking out of our Nintendo 64? Then below the console they're saying, cripes, we'd better get on with it then. Here goes. Very dramatic. The main bit is this list of 10 promises from the magazine, laid out like some kind of manifesto. Number 1 is classic magazine hyperbole. Nintendo 64 is the best games console ever created, and its best games are utterly incredible. Bit strong, even back then, but we were all excited, weren't we? They go on about reviewing all the new N64 games from everywhere, promising they'll only use the most skillful reviewers. Sounds like they're taking themselves very seriously. Then it's the usual stuff about playing games properly before judging them, packing the mag with tips and secrets, and not being afraid to call a bad game bad. Fair enough. They say they'll show exciting pictures, avoid tedious waffle, we'll see about that, won't we, and give advice. Finally, promise number 10 is that the magazine will be everything a Nintendo 64 fan could possibly want every month. Lofty ambitions. It's all very much of its time, isn't it? That feeling of new console excitement, everyone scrambling to be the best N64 source, and the magazines all trying to sound like they're the only ones you need. Good times, mind you, even if it was all a bit much sometimes. This page is the contents page from the first issue of N64 Magazine, dated April 1997. Right there in your face is Mario the big fella, advertising the main review, which is Super Mario 64. Starting on page 32, they're boldly claiming it's the most in-depth Mario review on planet Earth. Bit of a stretch, lads, but we were all desperate to read about it back then, weren't we? Other highlights are Shadows of the Empire on page 46, Pilot Wings, 64 feet on page 52, promising hang gliders and angry metal men, whatever that's about. Then there's Turok Dinosaur Hunter on page 58, and blimey, there's a competition to win the ultimate N64 setup, every kid's dream, and probably still is for some grown-ups, eh? Ah, simpler times. This page from the very first issue of N64 Magazine, dated April 97 no less, is a right blast from the past. We're straight into the news with Planet 64, and blimey, look at the headlines. Star Fox 64, Miyamoto's new shooter, Zelda 64, wonder what that ended up being like, and Blastcore from those local lads at Rare. Seems like they were promising some proper destruction. Then there's the usual newsy bits about the European launch, and even talk of the 64DD already. Those crazy add-ons Nintendo were always trying to flog us. Moving on, we've got Import Arena. Because back then, getting your hands on the Japanese and American games was a proper mission. Mario Kart 64 is slapped right at the top, and rightly so. Everyone was gagging for that after Mario 64 blew our minds. Deservedly so, they reckon, yeah, spot on. Killer Instinct Gold gets a mention too, remember the coin-op version? Then there's J-League Perfect Striker. Always a few of these Japanese footy games knocking about. And Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Indeed, even back then they were a bit unsure about how that one was going to turn out on the N64. Oh, and a little plus section with a random bunch of games like Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, Cruisin' USA, and even Mahjong Master for some reason. Over on the right we've got Team 64, the faces behind the words bless 'em. Jonathan Davies, apparently a PC gamer convert now thanks to the N64 and Mario Kart. Will Overton seems a bit obsessed with Japanese stuff, and they've got him playing Wonder Project J2, never did get my head around that one. James Ashton, the cool one in his leather coat, likes shooters, and J-League Perfect Striker too. Tim Weaver, the sports game fan who apparently swears a lot when he plays Charming. And ZY Nicholson, the Super Mario 64 guru who's completed it countless times and has holes in his trousers. What a character. Tyndall, down at the bottom, lifting the lid is all about taking the N64 apart, literally getting under the hood to see how it all works. Explaining the chips, reality immersion, marketing waffle alert, PAL versus NTSC, and how to get import games working, useful stuff back then. And finally, regulars, the usual magazine bits, tips, letters, game directory, subs, and a tease for next month's issue. Standard magazine fare really. This page from the first ever issue of Planet N64 Magazine, back in '97, is getting us all excited about Star Fox 64. It's almost finished. They declare, bless them, with Nintendo's latest shots. We've got a good look at the game with several screenshots dotted around, and they are banging on about the different camera views you can have, including first person, and even one from behind your R-wing. The reviewer reckons the behind the craft view is probably the best, which is debatable, isn't it? Toile. They're making a big deal about the bosses, saying they are the standout feature, and screen-filling parts, dramatic stuff. And apparently, the desert planet level gives you the chance to play as a tank, which is a bit of a surprise. Wonder how that works. Of course, General Pepper is popping up to give you mission briefings. As always, can't get rid of him. Down below we've got the Star Fox team looking a bit plasticy, but that's how they rolled back then. It mentions Star Fox 64 is a Nintendo game, naturally, and gives release dates April 28th for Japan and August for the UK. August. That felt like ages away back then, didn't it? And there's a little plug for On the N64 video too. Looks like they were trying to get in on that VHS action. Issue 1, eh? Good times. This page from the N64 Magazine, April '97 issue, it's all about Star Fox 64, or Fox 64 as they've called it here. Furry animals prepare for launch. A bit of a daft headline if you ask me, but it was the style back then. They've got a nice big picture of the R-wing front and center, looking quite swish, and then a load of screenshots dotted around showing off the game. You can see some of the action, explosions and that sort of thing. Typical gameplay shots really. Nits. The article itself is talking about how Nintendo were doing on the N64, after Mario 64 blew everyone away, and how they were bringing these 16-bit classics into the 3D world. They mentioned Pilot Wings, Wave Race and Mario Kart, saying they were alright, but people expected more. Then they get to Star Fox 64, which is a proper update of the old SNES game. Apparently some people thought the original Star Fox on SNES was a bit tiresome, can you believe it? But they are saying this N64 version is going to be amazing, astounding even, with all new 3D levels and proper freedom of movement. There's a bit of a joke about Slippy Toad as well, calling him a gormless toot, bit harsh on poor Slippy, even if he was a bit useless at times. But yeah, they are pretty hyped for Star Fox 64, reckon it's going to be magnificent, and finish off with a go! Go! At the end. Classic magazine stuff that. Takes you back, doesn't it? This page depicts a good old blast from the past, eh? It's a page from N64 Magazine, issue 1, April '97, and it's all about Star Fox 64, or Lilat Wars as we might remember it over here. Future look they're calling it, bit dramatic, but fair enough, it was the future of gaming back then, wasn't it? They're going on about how this Star Fox game is more than just on-rail shooting. They're saying you're guided through levels with sound bites and then you get these massive boss battles. Sounds pretty standard for the time, but they're really hyping up the explosions and the intelligence of the machines. Apparently the AI is spot on, responding cleverly to your moves. We'll see about that, won't we? The big thing they're pushing is the 4-player mode. Split screen like Mario Kart. They mention you can play as Fox McCloud, Falco Lombardi, Peppy Hare and Slippy Toad, taking on the baddies together or against each other. Cooperation or violence, your choice, apparently. Either way, the bosses are coming for you, no messing about. There are a few screenshots, blocky polygons as you'd expect, but you can see the split screen action, and the R-Wings blasting away. It's all very colourful and fast-paced, looks like a proper arcade experience in your living room, which is what we were all after, weren't we? Then there's a section called Character Building. They're giving us the lowdown on the Star Fox team, and even General Pepper and the villains. Fox is described as stoaty, and likes a tipple, classic. Falco is the moody one, Slippy's a bug-eyed freak, but lovable apparently. And Peppy's got a dark past with myxomatosis. Bit grim for a rabbit, even in space. General Pepper's the wise old mentor figure, and the villains are just a nasty bunch, ready to avenue you apparently. They've thrown in some daft descriptions, like Falco having a 400 cms diameter beak. Bit over the top, lads. They finish off saying the European release isn't until the end of the year. Typical, we always got games last. But they're promising to cover it more in their import section, oh fancy, in the next couple of issues. Overall, it's making Star Fox 64 sound pretty good, even if they are laying it on thick with the superlatives. Reminds you of being properly excited about the N64 launch, doesn't it? Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, April 1997 issue, is all about the upcoming Star Fox 64. It's issue number 1, so we are all eager to see what they think of Nintendo's new console. There's a section called Jolt into Action, which seems to be about a Rumble Pack add-on for the N64 controller. They're saying it's unlikely to be included with the European or American copies of Star Fox 64, which is a bit of a swizz. Apparently Nintendo is pushing this new idea of vibrations in games, and this pack slots into the memory card slot and shakes and rattles when things explode, or when you are taking out those bosses. It looks like it will cost somewhere between £15 and £20, which is a bit steep for a bit of shaking, to be honest. Then there's a section called Cool Cinemas, and they are raving about the animated intro to Star Fox 64. Miyamoto wanted a fully animated real-time intro apparently, and they say it's astounding, which is magazine hyperbole for it's quite good. There are some screenshots showing off the intro and the game itself, including one where Slippy is popping up on screen saying something in Japanese, probably about shield analysis, knowing Slippy. The reviewer mentions a giant spider boss, and how Slippy is worried about it, which is fair enough, spiders are a bit grim. Fox McCloud gets a mention too, described as leading the way with his dynamic facial hair and sleek silky spacecraft. Bit flowery language there for a games mag, even for back then. It all ends with, "to be continued," and says they'll be reviewing Star Fox 64 in issue 3. So we'll have to wait a bit longer to see if it lives up to the magazine's early buzz, but Star Fox was always a solid franchise, so expectations are pretty high. This page is a blast from the past, straight out of N64 Magazine issue 1, April 97, proper old school. Right then, front and center we've got The Legend of Zelda 64, big and bold, screaming at you in yellow and black on a green background. You couldn't miss it. We're missing Link, it says above. Bit of a play on words there, clever lads. They're on about the new Zelda game for the N64, of course. Remember all the buzz about that? 3 years it had been since a proper Zelda game. An awfully long time, as they put it, which felt like ages back then. Apparently it was supposed to be a 64DD game first, that disk drive add-on thing, that never really took off. Imagine that. They reckon Nintendo decided to release it on cartridge first because the 64DD wasn't ready, and people were holding off buying the N64 for a decent RPG Zelda, naturally. There are a few screenshots dotted around the page looking a bit blocky now, but back then, wow, 3D Zelda, mind's blown. One picture shows Link fighting a Stalfos, that bony skeleton bloke, classic Zelda enemy. They even made a joke about his welly-wearing skeleton look, ha! Another one shows Link in Hyrule, apparently looking a bit empty, which they point out, so maybe not quite perfect yet. And there's another shot of Link chatting to a woman, probably Zelda herself, you know the drill, always getting kidnapped. They reckon the story will be in Hyrule again, rescuing Zelda from a dungeon somewhere. Standard fare really, but we loved it. Sword fights, puzzles, chatting to people, sounds like classic Zelda alright, but in 3D. Reckon The reviewer is trying to temper the hype a bit, says they're being inscrutable at Nintendo about how the game will actually work. Usual stuff, when you don't want to give too much away. They mention text-based speech only, no voice acting, which was pretty standard for the time. They compare it to Japanese RPGs, saying it'll be immersive and all that. Size TBA, and release TBA, under The Legend of Zelda, 64 inches Nintendo box at the side. Typical, always teasing us back then. Number 10 and N64 issue 1 at the bottom. Proper retro stuff this. This page in N64 Magazine from April 97 is all about the upcoming Zelda 64 game. Looks like they are calling it just Zelda 64 Feet for now, catchy eh? It's got these screenshots of Link in proper 3D, wandering around a town and battling a skeleton fella. Seems they're making a big deal about it being in 3D, saying you can run, walk and jump all over Hyrule like that's brand new, we've only been playing 2D games for decades. There's a bit where the reviewer is speculating about puzzle solving being more than just pushing blocks now in 3D, which fair enough, it probably will be. They reckon it might be out by Christmas, and if not, the Japanese will be rioting for their RPG fix. Bit dramatic maybe. Then there's this Time Bandit thing, which is a quick run-through of Zelda games from the past. They start in '87 with the first Legend of Zelda on the NES, which everyone and their dog had back then. Then '88, Adventure of Link, also on NES, which was a bit of a weird side-scrolling one, wasn't it? '91 they mention A Link to the Past on the SNES. Now that was a proper game, colourful and a bit more grown-up looking. '94, and it's Link's Awakening on the Game Boy. Good for on-the-go Zelda, even if it was a bit small on that screen. And then finally, bringing us back to '97, and Zelda 64, which they reckon is going to be amazing with the N64 power. Hopefully it will be good, and not lose the charm of the older games, in all this 3D malarkey. They're saying they'll be covering the game's development every month, so looks like we'll be hearing more about this one then. This page is a look ahead in N64 Magazine, issue 1, and it's all about Blast, which I reckon is meant to be Blast Core. Nuclear explosions mass sounds a bit dramatic for what was essentially smashing up buildings with diggers, but hey, that was marketing for you back then. They've got the big, bold title treatment, very 90s magazine style, Selway. There are a bunch of screenshots showing off the game. You can see these chunky 3D vehicles, what they call bulldozers, smashing into buildings and creating a right old mess. One of them's called Backlash, and another looks like it says SCA on the side. There's definitely a sense of destruction porn going on here, even if the graphics are a bit blocky compared to what we're used to now. The text boxes are going on about how it's not your average bulldozer, but it is part of your mechanized repertoire, whatever that means. Apparently the more you wreck things, the healthier your bank balance gets, which is a pretty good incentive for a bit of digital demolition. They're also banging on about screen-filling beauties and nuclear versions of explosions, which again sounds a bit over the top, but I suppose they're trying to sell it. It was the early days of the N64, everyone was excited about 3D, and anything looked impressive at the time, didn't it? There's also a shot of a train, and the caption says it might be part of the game's intro. So, looks like there's a bit of variety to the destruction then, not just buildings. Overall, it's a typical future look piece, trying to get us hyped for this new Nintendo game, Blast Core. It looked alright at the time. I remember thinking it was a bit different, though whether it lived up to all this amazing new pics and nuclear explosion stuff, well that's another question, isn't it? This page from N64 Magazine, April '97 issue, takes us back to a time when the N64 was still relatively fresh on the scene. It's all about Blast Core, or Blastozer as they've cheekily put in brackets there, coming from Nintendo and Rare, so you knew it was going to be something a bit special. Apparently, it's been in development for nearly 2 years, which in those days felt like an eternity. They're setting the scene with this 21st century future world that's gone a bit pear-shaped environmentally, with pollution and harmful gases. The main idea seems to be that this chemical freight carrier is steaming towards a city, and you, as part of Blast Core, need to clear the way. Bit of a demolition job really. They mention 8 different bulldozers, like Ramdozer, Backlash, Skyfall. Sounds like a right load of beefy machines ready for smashing things up. There's even mention of less heavy-duty vehicles like a muscle car, crane, and even a police motor for some reason. The screenshots are what you'd expect from early N64 days. A bit blocky but colourful. One shows a rocket-type vehicle blasting through the air, and another shows what looks like a bulldozer thingy knocking down a building, classic destruction derby stuff. They even mention minigames involving pushing explosive boxes into pool table pockets with a tractor, which sounds utterly bonkers, typical Rare, eh? Graphically they reckon it's not going to trouble Mario 64, which was already setting the bar pretty high, but they do say Rare have added some nice visual touches like metallic textures and water effects. They're talking about a European release date being unannounced, but reckon it can't be too far off. They also touch on Rare steering clear of Donkey Kong Country for now, and hinting at a secret project, probably what became Diddy Kong Racing I reckon, knowing what came out later. And of course they big up GoldenEye 007, which was on the horizon, and was definitely the game everyone was hyped about back then. All in all, it's a preview that's trying to build excitement for Blast Core without going overboard, sort of saying yeah it's gonna be decent, worth a look. We'll see if the full review next issue changes their tune. This page from the very first issue of N64 Magazine, April 1997, takes me right back. Ah, the heady days of waiting for the Nintendo 64. It's got that classic Planet N64 logo at the top, with the globe character looking rather excited, clutching a controller. The main article is titled, "A Word in Your Shell Like," typical magazine banter, and it's all about the editor Jonathan Davies and the team finally getting their hands on an N64. They're reminiscing about their first experience with Super Mario 64, saying how mind-blowing it was compared to the Saturn and PlayStation at the time. They were clearly smitten, as were we all back then, weren't we? They mention other games they've played since, like Turok. Dinosaur Hunter and Pilotwings 64, and even J-League Perfect Striker, which they admit is a bit useless. Probably because no one in the UK really cared about Japanese football games back then. They are building up the hype for future issues, promising to dissect every game and find every secret classic magazine stuff. Down the right side there's a feature called Britain's First N64 Owners. It talks about the Bath branch of Electronics Boutique being one of the first places in the UK to sell the console. There's a little interview with a 13-year-old lad called Fergus Reed, who's one of the lucky first 25 to get one. He reserved his back in January and is clearly excited about Mario 64, and also mentions he's looking forward to Turok, Mario Kart, and maybe even Doom. Doom on the N64? That was a bit different, wasn't it? He's asked if he could have any machine and he says yes. Well, who wouldn't have wanted an N64 in '97 if you were a kid? On the left, there's all the usual magazine info, issue details, staff names. Jonathan Davies is the editor, of course, Will Overton the art editor, and so on. Contributors listed include Z.Y. Nicholson and others, a whole bunch of names. Plus, all the contact details and subscription info. Standard magazine layout of the time, really. Brings back memories of queuing up to get this first issue and dreaming of playing Mario 64 in proper 3D. Good times. This page depicts a classic bit of N64 Magazine from April 1997, right after the Nintendo 64 launched in the UK. The main headline is all about how the N64 is selling like hotcakes. And it's true, getting hold of one back then was a nightmare. They only shipped a measly 20,000 consoles to the whole of the UK, and they were gone within hours on March 1st. Nintendo was patting themselves on the back, splashing sold-out headlines everywhere. Loads of people who hadn't pre-ordered were left disappointed, queuing up at shops and finding nothing. There's a bit called Nonsense of the Month, which is funny. It's about these N64 cartridge cases from Japan. Apparently they're see-through and have a spring so the game pops out a bit when you press a button. The magazine reckons they're pointless because you can't see what game is inside if you stack them horizontally. Bit of a silly gimmick, really. Then there are little interview snippets with blokes who've managed to get their hands on an N64. Ian Love, aged 19, says he reserved his 3.5 months ago and reckons it's the best thing around, and already has Mario 64 and Shadows of the Empire. Pete and Joe are also featured. Joe is 20, and they've got Mario and Pilotwings, and Pete is after Mario Kart and Wave Race. Brian Woodcock, 21, just wants to play it on a big telly. Adrian Thompson, 19, reserved his back in January and has Shadows, Mario and Pilotwings. Everyone seems to be buzzing about Mario 64 and Pilotwings, which were the big launch titles. They mentioned Turok and Wave Race as games they are looking forward to, and Pilotwings looks quite good. It's all very typical of the time, everyone desperate to get the new console and play the latest 3D Mario. Good times if you could actually get one. This page, from the looks of it, is a spread from N64 Magazine. Back in issue 1, April 97, it says there. Right at the top there's a section called Planet N64, showing off some bits and bobs you could get for your new console. Things like the SFX adapter, which was handy if you were importing games because, as you know, Japanese and American carts were a different shape, weren't they? Then there's stuff about video connections, S-Video for the best picture, AV, which was alright, SCART for those of us in Europe with tellies that used it, and even an extender if you wanted to sit miles away from the telly. Remember those days? Moving down, there's an article titled, Japan a Bit Quiet. Seems like things were a little subdued in Japan after the initial launch hype. It mentions Super Mario 64, of course, everyone had that, and Pilotwings 64. They mention Shadows of the Empire too, that Star Wars game. They're talking about future games like Wave Race and International Superstar Soccer 64, which were on the horizon at the time. Oh, and Star Fox 64 and Turok are mentioned as well. Sounds like they were looking forward to those. Interestingly, it talks about how Final Fantasy V-2 on the PlayStation was doing really well, and how that affected things for the N64 in Japan. Prices were being cut, trying to tempt people over, it seems. Over on the right, there's a piece called Even Big, all about the 64DD. Remember that? Never really took off, did it? They're saying it'll make games bigger and better. They mention Zelda 64, which we now know as Ocarina of Time was originally planned for the 64DD. Imagine that. And Mother 3 was another possibility. They even thought you could get update discs for games like Mario Kart, which sounds a bit mad now, doesn't it? And finally, at the bottom right there's America Frenzied, talking about the US launch of the N64 being a massive success, everyone going bonkers for it. Retailers selling it early and all that. Sounds like they were struggling to keep up with demand over there. Toys R Us are name-checked in there too, remember them? All in all, paints a picture of the N64 just starting out, full of promise and potential, both here and across the pond. This page depicts a right old laugh, it does, We've got a bit of a story on the left there called Mad Granny, and it's all about some crazy scenes in America. Apparently, folks were queuing up for N64s before Christmas, and some 58-year-old granny kicked off, trying to jump the queue, ended up in a punch-up over a console. Typical Yanks, eh? Then the main bit of the page is all about a free videotape this magazine is giving away, the N64 video, a feast of exciting new N64 games it says. Bit cheeky calling it a feast, it's a videotape, not a Christmas dinner. But fair play, it's got footage of loads of upcoming games. Part 1 is the Shoshinkai video, which is bits from some Japanese show, all in Japanese, but they reckon the games look fantastic, which is the main thing. Games listed are Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, Blast Corps, and this J-League Perfect Striker. Then part 2 is those games in full, and they are showing off Super Mario 64 again, cause why wouldn't you, it's Mario. Then Pilot Wings 64 for flying about, and Wave Race 64 for jet skis. Guaranteed success they reckon, a bit strong maybe. Part 3 is just called Plus, more random game footage. They've got Killer Instinct Gold, still doing the combo thing then. FIFA 64, which they say is out early April, but not great news for FIFA fans, sounds like a bit of a duffer. And Doom 64, proper blast from the past that one, out in the US but no UK date yet. Polya. And finally, Part 4, Mission Impossible, and Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. A couple of trailers. Mission Impossible, Ocean are doing that one, and it's just a film trailer apparently. A bit of a cheat. And Turok, Dinosaur Hunter again, Acclaim showing that off, dinosaurs and all. So yeah, bit of a mixed bag really. Some games we've seen before, some new ones, all crammed onto a videotape. Still, free is free, innit? And it's all about the N64 hype machine, keep us all wanting more. And on the left we have a picture of the console itself, and a bit of text saying games can be customized and demos downloaded, that modem thing they keep banging on about. Also apparently N64 sales are doing really well compared to PlayStation and Saturn, good on them. Typical magazine stuff really, getting you excited for what's coming. April 97, good times for gaming were ahead, even if half of these games were probably delayed to next Christmas. This page depicts an article in a magazine, looks like it's all about rally games coming to the N64. Right then, about time too if you ask me, because at the moment it's just Cruisin' USA for racing games, and let's be honest, that's about as deep as a puddle. The article is titled, Let's Off-Road, which is catchy enough. It's talking about how the N64 needs some decent races, comparing it to the Saturn with Sega Rally and the PlayStation with Wipeout and Ridge Racer. Fair point mind you, they do have a point there, Racer. They're previewing a game called Rev Limit. Sounds Japanese, doesn't it? Apparently it's being developed by a company called Seta. Never heard of them myself. Are they anyone special? Apparently they are not a household name in the UK. Well, we shall see. Shulkreek. Analwo. Anyway, Reverend Limit sounds alright. They say it's got proper car damage, not like those games where you just bounce off walls like a rubber duck. And different play modes, short races, long races with pit stops, even straight road racing. Which sounds a bit odd for a rally game, doesn't it? No two-player split screen though, which is a bit of a downer if you ask me. Warinstra, the magazine chap, ZY he's called, reckons it looks promising, but says it's maybe more like a touring car game than a proper rally game, and that it owes a bit to Ridge Racer, which isn't a bad thing. Ridge Racer was alright. It's supposed to be out late 97, size is TBA, whatever that means. Oh, to be announced probably. Warranty. There's also a little amazing rally fact bit, saying Japanese car makers dominate rally, and mentioning the Toyota Celica. Did they get banned for cheating or something? Something about technical irregularities, typical. So yeah, basically, N64 is a bit lacking in the racing department, but there are rally games on the way, and Rev Limit is one to watch. Let's hope it's a bit better than Cruisin' USA, eh? Fingers crossed. This page depicts two racing games that were on the horizon for the N64 back in April 97. First up, we have Multi-Racing Championship, which is coming to us Brits courtesy of Ocean in May. Sounds like they're pitching it as a rival to Sega Rally, promising realistic rally driving, and loads of different cars and tracks set around the world. They're banging on about realistic physics, as they always do, claiming it'll be just like the arcade hit. We'll see about that, won't we? They're showing some in-game shots, looks alright for the time, bit blocky as you'd expect on the N64, but colourful enough. Then there's Top Gear Rally, which is being made by some American studio. This one sounds like it's supposed to be the big one, the most eagerly awaited racing title apparently. They've been showing off these QuickTime videos, which sound fancy. Split screen 2-player is in, thank heavens, and they're boasting about lush graphics and realistic car handling again. Apparently they've even got real cars in it, like Toyota Supras and Ford Escorts. Even a Porsche 911 rally car, which is a bit of a bizarre choice, isn't it? They reckon it's coming in August, but they're already hinting it might be delayed, which is hardly a surprise, is it? Typical gaming mag optimism, gotta love it. Still, both of these races do sound promising for a bit of N64 action. Could be good for some beers and mates around the telly later in the year. This page is a look at FIFA 64 and J-League Dynamite Soccer. Blimey, FIFA on the N64. Remember all the fuss about the PlayStation version being a bit pants? Well, ZY seems to think this N64 version could be a bit of alright. They're saying it's been rewritten from the ground up, and is supposed to look much better than the PlayStation game, which is good news as that was a bit blocky, wasn't it? Oh, there are a few screenshots showing the game in action, looks alright. Bit like the footy games we were used to, but maybe a bit smoother. They're going on about faster gameplay and better camera angles, which would be nice. Apparently they've got all the proper team licenses too, Premiership and international teams, so that's a plus. It was supposed to be out in March, but now it sounds like April. Classic, isn't it? Games always getting delayed. ZY reckons they played a dodgy unfinished version and it was a bit sticky, whatever that means. But they're going to give it a proper review next issue against J-League Perfect Striker. Sounds like a bit of a showdown brewing there. Jory. Then there's a little box on J-League Dynamite Soccer from Imagineer. Japanese game this one then. Size and release date are still TBA, so who knows when that'll actually appear. They reckon it's similar to Konami's games, and Super Soccer 2 on the SNES, proper retro that. It's got motion capture and J-League stats, which is probably a big deal over in Japan. They say it doesn't look as good as Perfect Striker, but it might be alright for a bit of fun. Might even get a European release through Ocean, but don't hold your breath. Sounds like they're hedging their bets a bit on that one. This page gives us a sneak peek at a few upcoming bits and bobs for the N64. Back in April '97 it was. First up there's Creation, which sounds a bit like they're trying to do a Mario Paint for the N64, but they're calling it a much ignored multimedia package for the 64DD add-on, remember that? Made by Software Creations, who were doing the Blade and Barrel game too apparently. Sounds more like a tool than a game really, letting you mess about in 3D and make your own worlds. Intriguing I suppose if you're into that sort of thing. Then there's Yoshi's Island 64. Now the original Yoshi's Island on the SNES was a proper gem, wasn't it? Bit late in the SNES's life, but still, a looker. This new one's sticking with the 2D style, which is a bit of a surprise for the N64, but they say Miyamoto's making sure it's still got that special something, recreating the putty-like playability of the first one, whatever that means exactly. Judging by the screenshots, it does look pretty colourful and cartoony as you'd expect. They reckon it's graphically impressive, and well, it probably will be for the time. Lastly, we've got San Francisco Rush. After that Cruisin' USA game, which was a bit of a stinker if you ask me, you'd think they'd be giving driving games a wide berth. But no, here's Williams and Midway with a Daytona-inspired racer set in San Francisco. 8 players at once they're touting, which is good, and high speeds, naturally. Sounds like it could be alright, but the reviewer, Zai I think his name is, doesn't sound overly excited, especially with the CRUI Sun link. We'll see, I suppose. Go! It says at the bottom, bit enthusiastic for him. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1 it is, has a look at a couple of upcoming games for the new console. First up, there's Go! Troublemakers, which is a bit of a surprise, innit? Everyone's banging on about 3D on the N64, and these guys, Treasure, are sticking with 2D. Now Treasure, they did Gunstar Heroes and Guardian Heroes, back in the day, on the Sega. Proper good games they were. This Troublemakers thing looks pretty smart, mind you. Loads of colourful sprites and backgrounds, like they're really pushing what the N64 can do in 2D. Apparently you're this robotic housemaid called Marina who's got to rescue her boss. Sounds a bit bonkers, but the reviewer, ZY, reckons it looks absolutely superb. They even got a video of it on the cover tape apparently, which back then was a big deal. They're saying it's like Yoshi's Island 64 inches in some ways. High praise if you ask me. Then over on the right we've got Silicon Valley. Now this is from DMA, who are also doing Body Harvest. Silicon Valley, blimey, it sounds a bit odd. They say it's visually a bit like Mario 64 inches but with weirder ideas. You play as a robot called EVO, who can jump into animals to solve puzzles and get about. Rabbits, frogs, puppies, the lot, apparently even bears on unicycles. Sounds a bit mental, doesn't it? They say it's very early days for Silicon Valley still, but Body Harvest, their other game, is further along and looking rather tasty. We'll have to wait and see about these two then, won't we? This page from a retro N64 mag, dated April '97, is having a gander at some upcoming games. Right at the top we've got Sonic Wings Assault. Seems like a fairly standard air combat job, but the mag is keen to point out it's from the folks who did Pilot Wings 64. So, you know, potentially alright. Graphics are looking decent for the time, polygons and all that, and apparently you can have a 2-player dogfight. Coming out in the summer, apparently from Japan, so who knows when we'd actually see it over here. Then there's Wild Choppers. Seta are having another go after the disaster that was St. Andrew's Golf, bless 'em. This one's helicopters, looking a bit arcade-y, more about blowing stuff up than proper sim stuff. They're comparing it to the old Strike games, so you get the picture, lots of explosions, and not too much thinking. Japanese version in March, but no word for us Europeans yet. Always the way, innit? Rookie. Lastly, there's Blade and Barrel. Software Creations, they've been around the block, so this might be interesting. Another helicopter game, but this one's 4-player, air and ground combat. Sounds a bit chaotic, in a good way. 20 levels, loads of explosions, set in cities, deserts, industrial areas, the usual suspects. Weapons are Turok style, which probably means big and loud. Reviewer ZY reckons it's got potential, even if it's not going to win any beauty contests graphically. Sounds like a laugh with a few mates though, doesn't it? All in all, a mixed bag of potential hits and misses, typical of previews pages back then. This page showcases a couple of upcoming games for the N64, back when we were all still buzzing about getting our hands on one. Up first, it's Robotech, Crystal Dreams. Now, I remember Robotech the cartoon. Bit of a weird mishmash of Japanese anime, wasn't it? Apparently this game is coming from Gamatech, who also did that Vanna White's Wheel of Fortune game on the SNES, which doesn't exactly fill you with confidence, does it? Still, they're saying the screenshots look alright, and it's a space shooter where you're fighting these Ebolian and Zentriadi chaps. Sounds like a typical Save the Galaxy kind of affair, but they mention different endings depending on how you play, which is a bit fancy for the time. They're keeping shatum about it all though, typical game publishers. Due out sometime in the summer, size and release date are still TBA, that old chestnut. Then there's Dark Rift. Looks like a bit of a 3D fighter like Virtua Fighter or Tekken, but maybe a bit budget looking if I'm honest. Looks pretty nifty, huh? And is that a lightsaber that blue chap's holding? Bit of a giveaway from ZY there, eh? Seems to be from Victokai, who did some bits and bobs on the SNES and Game Boy, but nothing that set the world alight. They're saying it's got projectile attacks and combos and all that jazz, 8 characters to choose from, and Nintendo were supposedly impressed. Bit early to say if it'll be any good, mind you. ZY reckons it might be a bit whiffy compared to the big boys, but could put Victokai on the N64 map. We'll see about that. Goal 2. And lastly, there's a glimpse of Dual Heroes, another one with the polygonal fighters. Got a little on the N64 video badge, so maybe there's some footage of it on a videotape somewhere in the magazine. Looks a bit basic, but then they all did back then, didn't they? Early days for 3D gaming on consoles still, weren't we all just figuring it out? Anyway, that's the gist of this page, a quick peek at a few games heading our way on the N64. Fingers crossed at least one of them is a cracker. This page features a couple of game previews, and a bit of hype for another title. Up top we've got Dark Rift from Victokai. Looks like a 3D fighter, probably trying to muscle in on the Virtua Fighter and Tekken craze. 2-player, naturally, size TBA, which probably means they weren't quite sure how big the cartridge was going to be at that point. The screenshots show some blocky looking characters duking it out in what appears to be a jungle setting, quite typical fighter fare really. Then underneath is Dual Heroes by Hudson Soft. This one's described as a beat-em-up, and they're saying it's fully 3D. Unlike Mortal Kombat Trilogy or Killer Instinct Gold, they mention early versions only have 2 characters, Zen and Guy, sounding a bit like Power Rangers extras. They're also teasing some new AI feature. Again, the screenshots are a bit rough, but you can see what they're going for. 2 characters battling it out. Hudson Soft are mentioned as being busy in '97 with Bomberman 64 also coming, so they had a lot on their plate. Finally, there's a piece about Turok Dinosaur Hunter, which is presented in a rather dramatic way, with bold text shouting about another Torosaurus will have been senselessly slaughtered. It's all about men with automatic weapons slaying dinosaurs, very poetic. Apparently Acclaimer saying Turok has graphics so good, they blur the line between fantasy and reality. Bit strong that, isn't it? Save the Dinosaur is mentioned as some kind of propaganda from the game, and there's a warning about Turok being unleashed now on the N64. Classic marketing spiel, trying to make it sound all edgy and exciting. This page covers some RPG news for the N64. Right then, let's have a look. First up, it seems they are still banging on about Mother 3. Remember Earthbound on the SNES? Quirky game that one, wasn't for everyone. Apparently Shigesato Itoi, the chap behind it, is struggling to get it into 3D for the N64, bless him. They've had to draft in HAL Laboratories to help out, which is a bit of a worry if you ask me. Sounds like it's all gone a bit pear-shaped, development-wise. They reckon it'll be out late '97 or early '98, but you know how these things go, always a bit optimistic, aren't they? It's supposed to be a bit more of a standard fantasy setting this time, but with its own look, and they are even hinting at using the 64DD add-on and customizable characters. Let's see if that actually happens. Cassie. Io. Then there's Crystal Stories from Imagineer. They're saying it's like Zelda, or Holy Magic Century L-Tale, that's the Japanese name for what we know as Quest 64, I reckon. Sounds like a fairly standard RPG affair, bit more traditional they say, with your polygons and all that. Stories about a lad in Popeland becoming a spirit handler, which sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? They reckon it'll be out in Japan in the summer, and take about 40 hours to finish. We'll see if either of these RPGs are any good when they finally appear, won't we? Still waiting for a proper killer RPG on the N64 if you ask me. Zelda is looking good, but we need more than just Zelda, don't we? Square and Enix are being all standoffish too, typical. Anyway, that's the RPG news for now then. This page is a look at some upcoming games for the N64, and it seems to be focusing on Mission Impossible. They've got a little box at the top talking about it, saying it's from Ocean, size and release date, TBA, but aiming for June. Apparently it's based on the Tom Cruise film, where you play Ethan Hunt, the agent who's been framed. Sounds pretty standard fare for a movie tie-in really, but they're saying it's split into 6 missions, and the enemies are supposed to be clever, not just running at you, which would be a step up from some of the dross we've seen. The reviewer here, ZY, mentions Ocean are trying to move away from the Doom clone label and are pushing the social interaction bits, whatever that means. He does say the graphics are looking more detailed than Doom though, which is a good thing. Doom was getting a bit long in the tooth even then. There's a picture of a bloke in a white shirt and bow tie. ZY jokes he looks like an Italian waiter, and comments on the timer in the corner of the screen, saying he's got about 16 minutes left to do whatever it is he's doing. Another picture shows what looks like an office with computers, which ZY says resembles their game's testing room. Charming. There's also a shot of someone in black, looking a bit dodgy, in what might be an aquarium, and a final image that looks like a grand hall, all very dramatic. Moving on to the RPG news/previews section, it's a bit of a mixed bag. They reckon Shigeru Miyamoto is working on loads of new N64 games, rattling off Yoshi's Island 64, Jungle Emperor Leo sounds a bit odd, that one Super Mario RPG 2, and maybe even F-Zero 64. That F-Zero sequel would be something, wouldn't it? The SNES one was a belter. They mention Kirby's Air Ride is back to the drawing board, Tetrasphere is back on track, and then they start listing a load of other games. We've got a 64DZ version of Mario Paint, a new SimCity, Donkey Kong Country 64, and GoldenEye 007. GoldenEye, that sounds interesting. Apparently the bad guys react differently depending where you shoot them, a bit more sophisticated than just bullet sponges hopefully. Warrington Dorcas. Then there's a load of games from Williams/Midway, including Doom 64 and Final Doom 2, more Doom, just what we needed. Plus Centipede X, Robotron X, Joust updated arcade classics I suppose, but are they really what we want on the N64? They're also talking about Mace, The Dark Age, a beat MUP, Mortal Kombat 4, Grown Indeed, Mortal Kombat Mythology RPG, Bizarre, and Quake 64, Attack, and Biofreaks. Seems like there's a lot of stuff coming. Whether it's all going to be any good is another question entirely. They finish off wondering if Westwood are bringing Command & Conquer to the N64, which would be amazing if it happened, but they're not giving anything away. All in all, a pretty standard preview page, lots of promises. We'll just have to wait and see what actually turns out to be decent. This page from N64 Magazine, Issue 1, takes us to the Arena section, which is the review bit in it. Right then, what have we got? Looks like they're having a good old look at Super Mario 64, which was obviously the must-have game for the N64 at launch. They're calling it an incredible game and saying they've played it from start to finish, which you'd hope they had before reviewing it, wouldn't you? They're pointing you to page 32 for the full verdict. Warrington. Then we've got a bit on Mario Kart 64 in the import section. Remember when you had to get Japanese games early if you were desperate to play them? They've had a spin on the Japanese version and tell us to check page 66. They're going on about how they ruthlessly score games and only recommend the good stuff, and that they play games properly before giving out their Star Game medal. A bit full of themselves maybe, but you wanted to know if a game was worth your hard-earned cash back then, didn't you? Arena? Yeah, it was where you went to see what was worth playing on the new N64. This page shows a right proper look at some of the games N64 Magazine thought were worth a punt back in April '97. We've got a chap wrestling with a dinosaur for Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, which they gave a 58%. Make the best use of Turok's devastating array of weaponry, it says. Bit of a mixed bag that one was, wasn't it? Then there's Shadows of the Empire, the Star Wars game, with a moody picture of a droid. Scored a 46% apparently. A brilliant Star Wars game. Some bits are better than others, though let Yoda guide you through. Brilliant might be pushing it a bit for some of us back then, eh? Pilot Wings 64 gets a bit more love with a 52%, under the headline, Only the Nintendo 64 could recreate flying this convincingly. Always did look rather good, Pilot Wings. Then we've got Arena, and a whole list of games. Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey is on 74%, Killer Instinct Gold at 76%, J-League Perfect Striker 78%, Mortal Kombat Trilogy 84%, The Glory of St. Andrew's Golf at 86%, Cruisin' USA 87%, Mahjong Master and NBA Hangtime both get 88%, Wonder Project J2 is 89%, and right at the top is King of Pro Baseball with a whopping 90%. Quite a mix, from sports to fighters to Mahjong. Over on the right, there's the N64 Guide to Scoring. They reckon 85% and above is star game territory. The absolute best. 84% to 70% is for excellent high standards games like Mario 64 and Mario Kart, which is fair enough. 69% to 50% is irksomely unsatisfying, playable, but nothing special. 49% to 20%? Be a warning to you. And 19% to 0%? Well, they hope to never go there. Below that it explains the scoring categories. Visuals, sounds, mastery, lifespan and verdict. Standard stuff really. Visuals, sounds, how well you can master it, how long it'll keep you interested, and the overall verdict. Sums it up nicely, doesn't it? April 97, feels like a lifetime ago when we were all buzzing about the N64 and these new games. This page is from the first issue of N64 Magazine, and it's all about Super Mario 64, as you might expect for back then. It's got that bold statement, comparing Mario to Julius Caesar, bit much isn't it? But you get the idea, this was meant to be a big deal. And Super is splashed across the page in big letters. There's a massive picture of Mario in 3D, looking a bit gormless to be honest, but hey, 3D was the future, or so they kept telling us. Below that you've got some screenshots showing off the game. Bits of levels with Boris and Bowser and those weird blocky levels, classic Mario 64 stuff. It's really setting the scene for the N64, and what it was meant to be all about at the time. Pretty standard launch issue stuff, get everyone excited about the big game. This page in N64 Magazine is all about Super Mario 64, as you can probably tell from the massive picture of Bowser looming over everything. Right at the top there he looks a bit cheesed off, doesn't he? It's a proper splash page, that's for sure. Below Bowser you've got the big blue letters spelling out Mario 64, can't miss that. There's a bit of text in the top right, talking about the wait for the N64 and this game in particular. They're quoting Oscar Wilde. Bit fancy for a games mag, innit? Saying the game's taken its time to be finished properly, and they reckon it's been worth it. They even call Shigeru Miyamoto, Mario's dad, right cheeky that is, and that he wanted more time to work on it as a launch title for the console. They're saying it was a good decision despite the delays, and now we get to see why. Go! Go! They've written in a speech bubble thing, bit over the top. And then a no relation, under Miyamoto's name, what's that all about? Some in-joke maybe? To the left you've got a couple of those magazine logos, N64 Video, and N64 Star Game, with little stars and things. And then further down there's a screenshot from the game, looks like Mario in one of those tube levels, spinning around, remember those? Bit disorientating they were sometimes. At the bottom right, there's a little box with Super Mario 64 feet written on it, under the Nintendo logo. It says, 64M, must be 64 megabits, showing off how big it is, back when that was a big deal. Then it mentions controller pack battery backup, and on-cartridge backup, which was just the norm back then, wasn't it? Says out now and blimey, £59.95. Games were a bit pricey on the N64, weren't they? Still, everyone was desperate to get their hands on this. Yeah, this page is definitely trying to get you hyped for Mario 64 coming out, making out like it's going to be amazing and worth the wait, and to be fair, back then, it really was something else. It was Mario in 3D. Blew your socks off, it did. This page, taken from the very first issue of N64 Magazine from April 1997, is diving straight into Super Mario 64 as you'd expect really, being the big launch title. Under the heading Courses, they're starting with level guides, specifically Course 1 Bob-omb's Battlefield. We get a couple of screenshots showing off the game, one of Mario up on the mountain, and another of the Bomb King himself. There's a slightly cringe bit called Cheeky Chappy about Mario's face when you boot up the N64, something about a glove cursor of humility. Bit dramatic if you ask me, but hey, it's the first issue, gotta make an impression. Kanekali. The guide itself talks about Bob-omb Battlefield being a gentle challenge to ease you into 3D gaming. Perhaps they were being kind, it could be a bit disorientating for some at the time. They mention the Bomb King boss fight and the tactic for beating him: run around the back, pick him up and chuck him off the edge. 3 throws and your problem's over, according to reviewer ZY, pronounced Zai. Sounds a bit simplistic, but fair enough. They also point out bits like chain chomps and cannonballs to watch out for on the level. Down at the bottom there's a tip called Shell sur F about riding Koopa shells to get around quicker and unharmed, even over lava, which was pretty neat trick to know back then. And a small reminder about the N64 controls, with a picture of the controller. All in all, a nice little intro to Mario 64, and the kind of tips you'd expect in a brand new N64 mag at the time. This page covers a couple of bits from Super Mario 64. Firstly, it's having a look at the camera system, which they've dubbed TVI. Remember Lakitu, that little fella who throws spinies at you in the old Mario games? Well, apparently he's the cameraman in this 3D world, following Mario about on a cloud. They are explaining how the camera works with the analog stick, showing the controller layout with arrows pointing to the stick and C buttons. Sounds a bit fiddly to get your head around at first, having to use the R button and C buttons to move the camera compared to just holding right on the D-pad in the old days. It's a bit of a jump in it, but they reckon mastering it is key. Then there's a bit on N64 Stunt, which is about messing around with bow-bombs. Apparently you can get them to chase you and lure them into each other. Bit of a laugh, I suppose, creating your own entertainment when you're not busy collecting stars. They call it bomb baiting. Sounds like something a bored kid would come up with on a rainy afternoon, to be fair. There's also mention of a race against a giant Koopa Trooper. A Koopa the size of a transit van, they say. Bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but it paints a picture. Seems like this Koopa is a bit of a cheat, chugging up hills where Mario struggles. Cheeky. They hint at a shortcut to beat him though, using a warp by stepping on a niche. Sneaky. It's all about Power Star number 2 apparently, so early doors in the game still. All in all, it's a decent little page, giving you a nudge in the right direction with the camera, and pointing out some of the daft things you can do in Mario 64, beyond just the main objectives. This page from the first issue of N64 Magazine takes us right back to April 97, doesn't it? Ah, N64, shiny and new. So, the page is diving into Course 2 of Super Mario 64, Hoomps Fortress. They're calling it Retro World, which is a bit rich considering the game had barely just come out, but I suppose compared to the 2D Mario games it was, retro. They mention familiar enemies like piranha plants. And the screenshots show Mario navigating those classic moving platforms and the thwomps, those grumpy stone blocks that try to flatten you. The text talks about the Lakitu Bros and how they show up early on in this course. Apparently you're meant to sneak up on the piranha plants, which sounds a bit daft, to be honest. Whoever sneaks up on a piranha plant, you just jump on it, innit? They are pointing out you can get coins from the womps by butt slamming their cracked backs, which, yeah, good tip that. There are little captions with chestnut ratings, which is a bit of a weird name, but whatever. One asks if you can grab a coin without getting pushed off by moving blocks, rated a 6. Another one is about the rising and falling thwomps, a tougher 9 they reckon. And then there's one about the disintegrating bridges, rated an 8. Cheeky blighters who makes these bridges indeed. Ruh. Down at the bottom there's a section called He Flies, all about using the wing cap. Remember the wing cap? Bit of a game changer that, flying around in Mario. They're explaining the controls with the analog stick, how to dive and climb and bank. They mention you can exchange speed for height, which is fair enough. A bit like the laws of diminishing returns. Bit fancy for a Mario game write-up. They say to jump on the spot 3 times, or long jump to use it, and then you're off, soaring through the sky. Those were the days, working out all these new 3D controls. Good times. This page from an old N64 magazine, must be April 97 going by the corner there, is all about Super Mario 64 of course. What else would you be playing back then? It's a tips page really, breaking down some of the tricks you could do, or things to watch out for in the game. You've got screenshots scattered about showing different bits, like Mario facing off against a womp footy pitch fizzog they call it, haha, good one. And another one with Mario seemingly hiding from a thwomp, cheeky sod. They're pointing out how those thwomps like to play tricks and wait for you. Then there's a bit about hiding your Achilles heel from Koopa Troopers, which is your backside apparently, who knew? There's a section called Scrapping, which is all about combat, saying you should try all sorts of attacks on enemies, even if they look invincible. Bit of a weird reference to Finnish cousins in there. Wonder what that's all about. Then, 6-Foot Pizza. That's a daft title, but it's about belly flopping and using air brakes for safe landings when you fall from high up. Remember trying to work out how to not take damage from big falls? Then, they even go into camera controls, saying holding UPC gives you an overhead view when you're flying about, and how to use your shadow to judge your height. Fancy that level of detail back then. And then there's some complicated stuff about doing loops and corkscrews in the air using the controls in a certain way. Bit fiddly that always was. Ki. Ki yi ji. Yeah, just a page of Super Mario 64 tips really, back when we were all still figuring it out. Good times, good times. This page from N64 Magazine, Issue 1, takes us back to the early days of the Nintendo 64 and Super Mario 64. It's focusing on Jolly Roger Bay, which is Course 3. Looking at it now, you're reminded how revolutionary the 3D gameplay was back then, eh? B. The reviewer is talking about how the level design is testament to nature, which sounds a bit highfalutin for a Mario game, but I suppose they were trying to emphasize how different it was from the 2D side-scrollers we were used to. They mention the narrow stretch of beach at the start and how you can wade into the water, which was quite something at the time, being able to actually swim in a Mario game. There are tips about giant clamshells showing off red coins, and how if your health meter wasn't losing segments you were relaxing too much, which is a polite way of saying get on with it, Mario. They also mention underwater chests and puzzles, and getting electric jolts if you get it wrong, classic Nintendo trickery. Kibby. There's a bit about cannons too, saying you'd have to be mad to travel any other way. Typical magazine exaggeration. They explain how cannons are activated by pink bob OMBs, which is a fair point for those new to the game. And a tip about aiming at 45 degrees, always useful. Down at the bottom there's a section on He Swims, explaining the controls for swimming with the B button. It mentions holding B for paddling and tapping B for a bit more speed to overcome currents, plus that you can restore health by surfacing, which is a good basic tip for anyone struggling with the water levels. The screenshots show Mario on the beach, swimming underwater, and near a treasure chest, giving you a flavor of the level. It all looks a bit blocky now, bless it, but back then it was mind-blowing stuff. Overall, it's a decent overview of Jolly Roger Bay, probably helpful to someone just getting their hands on Super Mario 64 back in '97. Makes you feel a bit old looking at it now, mind. This page depicts a feature on Super Mario 64 from an old N64 magazine, probably around issue 1. Looking at it, it's all about the first star in Dire Docks, plunder in the sunken ship. Remember that level? Proper swimming bit that was. Ooh! The reviewer, Zai, seems pretty chuffed with the game, talking about how smashing boxes for Power Stars is proper cathartic, and how it's all action-based puzzles. He mentions going back for Star 2, and noticing the galleon had floated up to the surface. Bit of a giveaway that, eh? Still, back then it was all mind-blowing stuff. There's a bit in a yellow box about poles, which is just your basic controls for getting off poles in the game. Z to drop, A to jump back, and then climbing up and doing a handstand to get 1-up mushrooms. Standard fare really, but useful for new players I suppose. Jig. Then there's a load of screenshots and captions. One mentions fish having a peculiar habit of shoaling in bubbles. Deep stuff for a Mario game. Another one's about an open hatch and says, get inside now, goddammit. Bit strong for N64 magazine, weren't they usually a bit tamer? Ah well. There's another one about getting rewarded, showing a crate with coins, and one about pad hurling moments, which is probably about getting frustrated and throwing your controller. We've all been there. And another that just says, Lady Luck honors an IOU and, now if I can just reach. Cryptic. Right at the bottom there's an N64 tip for getting out of the water onto ledges when there's no shore. It's that trick of facing the ledge, pulling back on the stick, pressing jump, letting the stick return to neutral, and then pressing jump again to bounce up. Actually, that triple jump thing he mentions is probably pushing it a bit from that starting point, but yeah, good tip for getting out of the water. And yeah, that's about the page, all very Super Mario 64, focused on this one level and some basic tips. Takes you back, doesn't it? Simpler times when this sort of thing was actually news. This page focuses on Course 4, Cool Mountain, in Super Mario 64. Right then, everyone was banging on about Mario 64 of course. It was the big launch title for the N64, wasn't it? This article here is a guide through one of the levels, and it's quite a good one actually, gets you in the mood to have a go. They're calling it a slippy slidey ice world, which is about right. It talks about the rolling snowball chases and rickety lifts, all that sort of thing. Says it's rarely done well in games, ice levels, but Mario 64 gets it right. They mention the deadly precipices too. Which, yeah, there are a few places where you can easily fall off and lose a life. Very annoying. They are pointing out the lines of coins and how they guide you, which is a good tip, like moist crumbs in an enchanted forest. Bit flowery language for a game guide, but there you go. It talks about the cabin at the start and how you can backflip off the chimney to get coins. And of course the penguin. Everyone remembers the penguin. They call it cute and ornithological. Showing off a bit there, aren't they? The slide rules bit is helpful. Explaining how to control Mario on the slides, pushing forward to go faster, pulling back to brake. That's key info for anyone starting out. Apparently novices go too slow at first, which is funny, you'd think it would be the other way around. They even mention Charlie Brown and centrifugal force. Bit much for a game guide innit? But it does explain why you need to be going fast to stay on the track. Choo! The belly flop tip for the slide is a good one too, and they mention the penguin baby mission, about finding the lost infant. "Egad! My baby!" says the screenshot of the penguin mum. Dramatic, aren't they? They're saying it's not easy babysitting, which is true, that penguin does wobble about a bit. They've got little captions under the screenshots, a bit of light-hearted commentary. As predicted, a world of adventure preceded by a dark foreboding hole. Under a picture of the mountain with a dark entrance. And, can these two snowy scenes possibly be related? We think they might, it's just the way our brilliant minds work. Next to two similar-looking snowy bits. Bit of a laugh, aren't they? And then there's ice to see you, no, wait, come back, it wasn't even my joke. Next to the penguin joke picture. Corny. Note my humble energy bar. It happens to the best of us. Yeah, we've all been there, haven't we? Running out of energy at the worst moment. Warringtoner. Overall, it's a decent look at Cool Mountain, reminds you of having a go on it back in the day. ZY, the reviewer, seems to know their stuff, even if they are a bit keen on showing off with the fancy words. Good memories though, Mario 64, proper classic. This page depicts a review of Super Mario 64 from an old N64 magazine, it's issue 1, back from April 1997, can you believe it? It's focusing on Dark World 1 battle with Bowser. There are a few screenshots dotted around showing Mario in those gloomy bricky levels, you know the ones, and of course Bowser himself looking a bit menacing, as he does. One of the pictures even shows Mario running towards a picture of Peach, which is a bit of a laugh. Apparently the picture changes. Waha, Hassady. Very funny, eh? Hassady. The review talks about how these Dark World levels might seem a bit basic at first, linear even, compared to what we maybe imagined 3D platforming to be, but they're all about building up to the Bowser fight. The reviewer, ZY, reckons they work quite well and are hard enough, and they do manage to hide the fact that these Bowser battles are actually pretty short and not too taxing really. They mention the usual 8 coins for a star, 1-ups, and mushrooms, the standard stuff you expect. It makes a point about how Bowser's attacks are a ground stomp and fire breath, and to beat him you need to grab him by the tail and spin him into those spiked bombs, classic Bowser tactics. It even brings up the Bomb King fight from earlier, saying it's a similar idea. They make a joke about Dennis Hopper, or Dennis Hopper apparently being Dennis Hopper 4 times, which is a bit odd. I guess it's just a quirky bit of magazine humor from the time. There's a section on jumping, with tips on backflipping, saying it's good for beginners and a reverse somersault is really helpful. It explains how to do it, running and jerking the stick, the usual thing, and that it's good for getting out of a tight spot when platforms give way. It mentions wall kicks too, for reaching higher spots, a bit Mega Man style they say, to scale sheer surfaces. All in all, it's a decent look at one of the early levels, nothing too groundbreaking, but back then, Super Mario 64 was still pretty mind-blowing, wasn't it? Flaming trousers indeed. This page depicts a feature on power-ups in Super Mario 64 from, blimey, N64 Magazine issue 1, back in '97. Crikey, remember getting this mag? Anyway, they're talking about the different caps Mario can get his mitts on in the game, which are a bit different from the usual mushrooms and fire flowers we were used to. Yeah. First up is the wing cap, which lets Mario fly about. Though, as they rightly point out here, it's more gliding than proper flying. Still, remember the first time you popped that red box and suddenly had wings? Magic. In it, they reckon it's a good way to see the levels, and they compare it to Pilot Wings 64, which I suppose makes sense given both were on the N64 and all. Bit of a reach maybe. Then there's the metal cap, or Terminator Mario as they jokingly call it. This one makes Mario invincible and heavy, so he can walk underwater. Very handy for those underwater bits that could be a right pain otherwise. And smashing through enemies too. They even hint at a puzzle related to this. Something about being vital to some puzzles. Intriguing that. Next we have the Vanish Cap. This one makes Mario invisible, and able to pass through walls and enemies. Sounds useful for sneaky bits and shortcuts. They say some puzzles need this cap, and that some surfaces aren't as solid as they look, so keep your eyes peeled, eh? It's a bit like being a ghost, which is quite a cool idea for a Mario power-up, I reckon. Cool. Finally, they talk about the switch courses. These are unlocked by finding special colored switches red, green and blue. The red switch course is all about landing on a tower and hitting a switch to make red boxes appear everywhere in the game. The green switch course is hidden in course 6, and you need to ride Nessie, or Dory as they call her, to get to it and activate the green switch. This one makes green boxes, with metal caps, show up. And lastly, the blue switch course needs you to drain the castle moat, after beating Bowser the first time mind you, and then butt stomp some pillars to drain the water and find the blue switch. This one gives you Vanish Caps, So basically, you need to do a bit of exploring to find these switches and get the full set of caps. Sounds like a proper adventure, doesn't it? Good times. This page of N64 Magazine, blimey, it's a blast from the past, isn't it? We're having a look at Super Mario 64, as if we weren't already completely obsessed with it back then in April '97. It's got that distinctive yellow and red border, classic N64 Mag style. Warrington Norse? Right, so what's ZY on about here? Shy Guys, he's calling them, and he's not wrong. He's saying the enemies are a bit thin on the ground in this game compared to Super Mario World. Bit of a reach that, wasn't it? I mean, no, it's not constant Koopa Troopers, but there's still plenty to bop on the head. He says it's because the levels are more complex. Fair enough, I suppose. He's talking about the waterfall level, saying it's a trek back if you mess up. And then he mentions the green cap switch course and finding a secret star by grabbing all 8 red coins. Remember those red coins? Always a bit of a faff. He suggests using the metal cap from that yellow box near the waterfall. Good tip actually, might have missed that at the time. There's a bit in green about the quicksilver pool and some rather odd mention of miners, beer and bread-based mycotoxins. Bit cryptic. ZY, bit cryptic. Probably just him being a bit silly, as usual. Practical. Then there's a section in blue about the vanish cap, yeah, walking through walls and all that. He's saying get the blue switch course secret star by getting 8 red coins again. Deja vu much? 4 on the slope and 4 on the lifts, he says. And then the power star appears behind the wire mesh grill. He's also mentioning getting a 1-up by collecting 3 gold coins there too. Always good to know, those 1-ups were precious. And right at the bottom he's on about that first slippy slope and crawling up it like an Italian Spider-Man by holding Z trigger. Italian Spider-Man? What's he on about? Oh, he means like Spider-Man, but you know, Italian. Alright ZY, calm down. He's saying you can crawl up and down it on your hands and knees. Handy for grabbing those pesky red coins again then, isn't it? Italian. Yeah, classic Mario 64 stuff. Takes me back, this does. Good times, good times. This page in the magazine is all about Super Mario 64. As you'd expect really, it was the big launch title everyone was gagging for at the time. The reviewer, Zai I think it is, starts off a bit over the top saying it's divided the world into those who've played it and those who haven't. A touch dramatic maybe, but it did feel like that back then. It was a proper step change. They're raving about the visuals being a sensory shock and going on about Mario's moves being versatile, which to be fair they were, especially after years of 2D platformers. They call the levels a playground, which is a decent way to describe it, loads of hidden bits and shortcuts everywhere. They even mention climbing a tree and Mario doing a somersault, just for the sake of it. Madness. There's a bit about the sound too, and how the music changes as you play. Apparently the background music reacts to what you're doing. They're sticking up for Koji Kondo, the composer, because some folks were having a go at him for chip music, which is a bit daft really. They reckon the music is spot on, mentioning spooky marimbas and sitars and tablas, getting a bit fancy for a Mario game if you ask me. Then they get a bit carried away trying to explain how massive it is, saying it's like Mario World plus Zelda 2i plus Super Metroid plus Yoshi's Island, multiplied by 3D and divided by 0. Bit much, but you get the idea. The playground comparison comes up again, saying it's all about exploration, but then there's a slightly odd dig about playgrounds not being dangerous enough, unlike Mario's World, mentioning something about Morticia Adams in town planning scandal. Bit of a strange reference, but I suppose they mean the game's got its challenges. They finish off banging on about the N64's power, saying it's better than PCs and other consoles at the time. Typical console hype, but it did feel like a big leap forward graphically compared to what we were used to. There are some screenshots showing bits of the game, rainbow bridges, inside levels, classic Mario stuff, but proper 3D. Yeah, good times, good times. This page from N64 Magazine looks like it's reviewing Super Mario 64, which, let's be honest, was a bit of a system seller for the N64, wasn't it? You've got Mario plastered all over the page in those lovely polygonal graphics that were mind-blowing at the time, jumping about in all sorts of bonkers levels. There are screenshots showing off different bits, like those cube puzzles, spooky ghost houses and Mario clinging to a pole like some kind of plumber monkey. The writing's all about how revolutionary it was, going on about surfaces and textures and your butt on a Burton, whatever that means. Bit dramatic, aren't they? They're banging on about pop-up too, remember when that was a proper issue in games? Apparently Mario 64 is supposed to be brilliant because you don't get much of it. Good for them. There's a section called Spoiler, which is a bit rich considering it's a review, but I suppose they're trying to say don't ruin it for yourself by reading too much, which is fair enough I suppose. They mention the Japanese version, and how the English one is better because it's less text-heavy with hints. Down the side they've got these little boxes rating the game on visuals, sounds, mastery, lifespan, giving them top marks mostly, 9s and 8s. Words simply cannot do it justice, they say, for visuals, a bit over the top, but it did look pretty special back then. Sounds are simple fare, but cleverly done. Mastery is a totally immersive lesson in game design. Getting a bit deep for a Mario game review, eh? Lifespan, they reckon it's a disaster to finish it because you'll have to start again. Well, some of us have lives, you know. The verdict is a whopping 96%, which is pretty impressive. Apparently the reviewer, some chap called ZY, pronounced Zai, apparently reckons sufufum is the only word to describe it. Some made UP nonsense, I expect. But hey, it's a good score, isn't it? Seems they really liked it. And then it says, to be continued, teasing next month's guide on getting 70 stars fast. Gotta milk it for all it's worth, eh? Still, it was Mario 64, wasn't it? Hard not to be impressed at the time, even if they are laying it on a bit thick here. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1 it is, takes us right back to April 1997, and they're kicking things off with a look at Shadows of the Empire for the Nintendo 64. Big bold letters, can't miss it, Shadows of the Empire splashed across the top in orange, proper eye-catching for the time. There's a massive image taking up most of the page showing some in-game action. You've got a snowspeeder zipping about, and an AT-AT walker looming in the background, lasers firing everywhere, classic Star Wars stuff, and it looked pretty good back then, well, for the N64 anyway. Pakra. The article starts with the reviewer, Zai, getting all excited about Star Wars still being exciting, and the N64 being pulsarate record-breakingly exciting. Bit much perhaps, but it was a new console, and Star Wars, so fair enough. They're banging on about how everyone was hyped for the re-release of the Star Wars trilogy on video at the time, and this game was timed to come out around then too. Clever marketing. Apparently this Shadows of the Empire game is set between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, giving us 10 levels with different gameplay styles and a brand new story. They call it Nintendo/LucasArts Brilliance. Bit strong, but they were impressed it seems. They've got this thing called the Yodometer, which is their fancy review score, and they reckon it's going to be good. Before you even start playing, they tell you a bit about the main character, Dash Rendar, who's supposed to be a mate of Han Solo, never heard of him in the films mind you, and his ship the Outrider, which is similar to the Millennium Falcon, and his co-pilot Lebo, who's a mechanical mate. There's also a bit about challenge points, scattered through the levels, little icons to collect for extra lives and bonuses if you get them all. Typical game extras to keep you hunting around. Share ding ding day. Down in the corner there's a little box with the game details. Shadows of the Empire, obviously from Nintendo and LucasArts. It needs 64 megs of memory, uses the controller pack for saving, and it was out then, April 97, priced at £59.99. Blimey, games were pricey back then, weren't they? But if you were a Star Wars fan with an N64, you were probably queuing up to get your hands on this one. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1, takes us back to April 97, and a look at Star Wars, Shadows of the Empire. Crikey, seems like yesterday, doesn't it? This is before the prequel trilogy even started messing things up, so pure original trilogy goodness. First up, Level 1, The Battle of Hoth. Classic stuff, eh? The page talks about taking down AT-ATs and AT-STs in your snowspeeder. Your mission, it says, destroy the Imperial forces. Real subtle that, wasn't it? It mentions the analog stick being superb, and how good the graphics were for the time, second to none apparently. Well, they were decent for the N64's launch, I suppose. They were pushing it, bless them. There's a bit about using the tow cable to trip up the AT-ATs, and how on harder difficulties it's actually, challenging. Imagine that. They're giving it a Yoda score of 9 out of 10 for this level, which is pretty generous to be fair. Everyone was hyped for Star Wars back then. Then we move on to Level 2, Escape from Echo Base. Bit of a change of pace this one, going from flying around in a snowspeeder to running around inside Echo Base. They say after the fantastic opening, which I guess is the Hoth bit, it goes to a Doom-style first-person view from Dash Rendar's shoulder. Dash, eh? Trying to be the new Han Solo, weren't they? Apparently the Stormtrooper animation isn't all that, but the AT-ST boss is tricky, if you just keep behind it. 4. Helpful tip there. For challenge points, it mentions secret doors, red cylinders, and wampus. Wampus are tough, but slow, apparently. No problem, they say. Famous last words. This level only gets a Yoda score of 5. Ouch. Seems like they weren't quite as impressed with the interior bits. They even have a little caption saying playing with the over-the-shoulder view can make things unnecessarily hard. No kidding. ZY, no kidding. Ah, good times, good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1, takes me right back, doesn't it? April 97, the N64 was still pretty new, and we were all still figuring out what it could really do. Here we've got a couple of game reviews under the banner Way of the Force, the Dark Side, so clearly Star Wars games are on the menu. Begay. First up, Level 5, Gaul Spaceport. This is for what must be Shadows of the Empire, given the Boba Fett mention. Set on the moon of Gaul, which sounds suitably Star Warsy. The reviewer, bless him, seems quite taken with it, calling it definitely one of the best first-person levels. He's banging on about jetpacks, which was still a bit of a novelty in games back then, and mentions timing your jumps to avoid ventilation fans. Sounds like a bit of a platforming puzzle. Apparently, your gun auto-targets enemies, which, depending on the game, could be either helpful or a bit handholdy. There's also shuttles to move you between sections and a mid-level ATST boss, a classic bit of Star Wars action. He gives it a Yoda score of 7, which is pretty decent, clearly enjoyed it, even if he admits you'll certainly not finish level 5 on your first couple of goes. He also talks about finding challenge points, including some indoors and on top of a tower. Standard collectathon stuff really, but we lapped it up back then. Boring. Then we have level 3, the asteroid field. Again, this is Shadows of the Empire, this time in space. Asteroid belt around Hoth, classic stuff again. Mission is simple. Shoot down TIE fighters and bombers. Now this one, the reviewer isn't quite so impressed with. He's a bit down on the how it plays, saying none of the views give the arcade feel they were after, and there's not enough variety to hold your interest. Ouch. He even calls it a big disappointment. The challenge points here are hidden inside red asteroids, which sounds like a bit of a pain, but he admits the rest of the level is far too easy. Bit of a mixed bag then. This one gets a Yoda score of just 3, poor show. You could play it from inside or outside the Outrider, which is a nice touch for the fans I suppose. Challenge point tips are to shoot the red asteroids to collect them. Groundbreaking advice that is. 6 altogether apparently, all hidden inside red asteroids, just in case you missed it the first time. So there you have it, a bit of a mixed bag in the Star Wars universe for the N64, according to Zai at least. One level a hit, the other a bit of a miss. Memories of simpler times when a Yoda puppet gave you a score. Classic N64 Magazine. This page depicts a couple of levels from the new Shadows of the Empire game for the N64, looking at level 7, Sewers of the Imperial City, and level 4, Ord Mantell Junkyard. Right then, sewers and junkyards. Sounds like a glamorous adventure already, doesn't it? Level 7 is set in the sewers of Coruscant, and your mission is to get through them to reach Zizza's palace. Apparently it's a bit of first-person shooting fun with the jetpack, and there are underwater sections too. They're even warning you about a Dianoga, you know, like that tentacle monster from the Death Star trash compactor in the first Star Wars film Lovely. They reckon this level is tough because of this Dianoga boss, especially as your laser gun doesn't work underwater, which seems a bit of a design flaw if you ask me. The challenge point tips mention 9 to collect, all before the boss, and 1 hidden behind a secret door activated by 2 switches in a big round room. Sneaky. This level gets a Yoda score of 7 out of 10, which is pretty decent I suppose. Level 4, the Ord Mantell Junkyard, sounds a bit more interesting at least visually. It's set on Ord Mantell, which was where Han Solo met up with Lando in The Empire Strikes Back, so that's a nice touch. Here you're trying to get to the front of a train, and then break into the salvation plant to meet IG-88, the bounty hunter. Apparently this level is a bit Doom-like with moving trains and carriages. They say it's more annoying than difficult, with enemies and laser beams everywhere. The tip here is to look for Seeker power-ups and health packs in the top right of the yard. Challenge points-wise, there are 12 on the train ride, and 3 in the salvage yard. This level only gets a Yoda score of 2, which isn't great, sounds like a bit of a slog then. The reviewer, ZY, doesn't sound overly impressed with the train ride, calling it annoying, so perhaps not the highlight of the game then. Still, it's Star Wars on the N64, so back then we were probably still quite excited whatever they threw at us. This page depicts a look at the N64 game Star Wars, Shadows of the Empire. We're having a gander at level 5, Zizza's Palace, which they're calling the final Doom level, and the last chance to use the jetpack, which sounds a bit dramatic. Apparently, you're tasked with getting through Prince Zizor's palace, Emperor Palpatine's mate, to blow up a space elevator. They mention skeleton droids and red soldiers as enemies, and the boss is a gladiator droid, which breaks into 3 bits. The reviewer, ZY, seems to think you need to stock up on disruptor ammo for that fight. It gets a Yoda score of 6, which is alright I suppose. Then we've got level 6, Mos Eisley and Beggar's Canyon, on Luke's home planet, Tatooine. This one's all about swooping around on a speeder bike and taking out swoop riders before they get to Obi-Wan Kenobi. The review reckons the controls are terrible, and the whole level is too fast and a bit of a mess. Killing the swoop riders by forcing them into walls is mentioned as a tip. Sounds like they weren't too impressed. giving it a Yoda score of just 1. They say it's largely hit and miss and disappointing, which is a bit harsh maybe, but fair enough if it's a bit clunky to play. They mention there are 12 feet Altons to find in this level, 8 in town, and 4 outside of it. Whatever Altons are probably some collectible things. Overall, it seems like a mixed bag for these levels of Shadows of the Empire. Some bits good, some bits not so much, which was often the way with these early N64 games, wasn't it? Bit rough around the edges sometimes. This page depicts a review of the N64 game Shadows of the Empire from back in the day, issue 1 no less, feels like a lifetime ago. Right then, we've got level 10, Skyhook Battle, getting a stonking Yoda score of 10, top marks then. Looks like you're flying the Outrider, Dash Rendar's ship, through space, battling TIE fighters and Star Vipers, around Zizor's space station, the Skyhook itself. Apparently it's even better than the Battle of Hoth, quite a claim that. Bit strong maybe? They say it's similar to level 3, and if you get into attacking the space station itself, you might not want to play another 3D shooter ever again, which is a bit of hyperbole, isn't it? Challenge is apparently easy against small fighters, but surviving the battle outside the Skyhook is dicey, needing good control of the Outrider. No challenge point tips though, you're on your own apparently, cheers for that then. What? Moving down the page we've got level 7, Imperial Freighter Suprosa, with a Yoda score of 5. This one's set inside an Imperial freighter, you're infiltrating it, and nicking secret Imperial construction plans. Looks like you're battling stormtroopers and loader droids. Classic stuff. They reckon it's a bit Doom style, with stormtroopers and loader droids, and you need a delicate touch to maneuver around obstacles. There's a large puzzle room as well apparently. Challenge-wise, it's another level lacking in length apparently, and you need to pump up the difficulty to get full mileage out of it. Challenge point tips for this one are 10 on offer, 9 before the boss and 1 after it, and 3 CPs in the large puzzle room. Handy to know that I suppose if you're bothered about challenge points, seemed a bit of a gimmick at the time if you ask me. There's this N64's patented Yodometer thing as well, measuring each level on a Yoda scale, 10 being top notch. The graph shows Yoda figures going up to 10, with levels 1 to 10 along the bottom. Levels 1, 2, 3 and 10 get top marks of 10 Yodas, looking very pleased with themselves they are. Level 7, the freighter level, gets a Yoda score of 5 on the graph as well, just confirming the score again I suppose. A 10 get. Down the right hand side we get the usual review bits. Visuals gets a 7, saying the first and last levels are superb, some are good, and a sad few are awful. Sounds gets an 8, saying it's not a John Williams score obviously, but the sound effects are completely authentic, which is probably true enough. Mastery gets a 5, saying challenge points add a lot, and it's uncomfortably Doom clone in places. Lifespan gets a 6, saying it's good as long as you play it on hard or Jedi, otherwise it's too easy. Finally, the verdict, calling it basically solid but lacking the innovation and brilliance of Nintendo's other launch titles. Ouch, bit harsh maybe? Get Turok before you get this apparently. Overall score is 78%. Reviewed by James. So there you have it, Shadows of the Empire. Solid but not amazing according to James, or should I say Zames as we're supposed to say it apparently. Still, 78%, not bad for a Star Wars game on the N64 back then. This page features a review for Pilotwings 64, right there on page 52 of the very first issue of N64 Magazine, back in April '97. It's got that headline, a bit cheesy really. The Beatles were right, you know. Being free as a bird is a good thing. Trying to be all profound about flight, you know, for a video game. Anyway, it's talking about how Pilotwings on the N64 is supposed to be this mind-boggling experience, especially considering the original on the SNES was already pretty decent for its time with that Mode 7 trickery. They reckon Nintendo's proven their genius again and give a nod to Paradigm Simulations who actually made it. They're banging on about it being technical proof of the N64's power and how it's got great structure, style and content. There are a couple of screenshots, one looks like you're hang gliding through some little town, and another, with a plane in a snowy area, looks a bit blocky now, doesn't it? But back then it was probably quite impressive. Warrior. Down the bottom, it has the game info, Pilotwings 64, Nintendo and Paradigm are credited. It's got the British flag there, saying it's 64 megs, 1 player, controller pack for save games, and it says out now, with a price of £49.99. Blimey, games were pricey back then, weren't they? It's labelled as an N64 star game, so they must have thought it was pretty good. And up in the corner, there's a little on the N64 video logo, so I suppose there was a video review on the bundled videotape. Remember those? Good times. This page depicts an article about hang gliding in the game Wings from N64 Magazine, back in April '97. Right at the top, it's got this headline, Walking on Air Hang Glider, and it's all about how to actually fly the thing in the game. They're saying it looks easy enough, no fuel to worry about, no rotor to catch on buildings, typical of games back then trying to be accessible, I suppose. But apparently it's trickier than it looks to really get good, especially with using the thermals to gain height, which is key for getting anywhere. They describe the thermals as these white cloud-like tubes, or orange blobs on your radar. Sounds a bit basic, but hey, it was 97. There are numbered steps showing you how to play. Step 1 is about mid-air starts and tapping the joystick to get to the thermal, and warning not to hold down unless you want to lose direction. Step 2 is about moving through circles, and that it's all fair game, you're meant to spread out and get them all. Step 3 is about being on course for the landing pad after the thermals, and how to turn and lower yourself. Step 4 is about landing, you need to be going around 70 kilometers per hour, drop your legs between 10 and 20 meters high, and aim for the outer ring. Step 5 mentions coming into the center for extra points, and they say it's tricky, and you need practice. Practice makes perfect, as they say, pretty standard gaming advice. Then at the bottom, there's a bit called Picking Pilots. They list 6 pilots you can choose from: Lara, Kiwi, Goose, Ibis, Hawk, and Robin. They're making a bit of a joke, saying in some quarters people thought these spindly pilots looked a bit rubbish, criticizing the lack of rendered muscle, but then they say the stick-thin necks and breakable legs are part of the comedy element, and watching them pile into a rock face is proof enough of that. A bit harsh, but that was the tone back then sometimes. It's just a bit of light-hearted fun at the end of the day, and maybe shows the limitations of the graphics at the time, but we were all pretty impressed with the N64 back then anyway, spindly pilots or not. This page showcases the rocket belt in Pilotwings 64, doesn't it? Remember that launch title? Easily the most satisfying of the vehicles, they reckon, and they're not wrong. Forward, backward and upward, it's all in the stick pushes. They say a tap of the unseen but beautifully useful Z trigger will stop you dead, which is handy, I suppose, when you're about to plow into a skyscraper. They're going on about circle-searching adventures with this rocket belt. Sounds a bit like busy work, but they do say to use your map to find the circles, and apparently good times are rewarded with points. There are some screen grabs showing these circles, and tip number 1 points out the map and compass. Tip 2 says there are no rules about which circles to go for first, so you can just lark about a bit in the early stages without worrying about fuel. Tip 3 is about cunningly placed circles and switching to a top-down view. And tip 4 is about landing, which they say is the easiest bit. Just drop your spindly legs softly onto the red landing pad for a plethora of points. A plethora, eh? Alright ZY, calm down. There's also a little night sight tip, saying if the daylight is too much, go to the waterfalls leading to the 3-fountain pond, find a cave behind a metal grating, and boom, night version of the level. Sounds a bit convoluted for just playing at night, doesn't it? But hey, it's 1997, secrets and hidden bits are king. Then there's a bit about island hopping. Pilotwings 64 has 4 islands apparently. Holiday Island is described as sunshine and fun, good for beginners with bucket and spade type shenanigans. Everfrost Island is a bit trickier, blizzard-like, and they say the gyrocopter is easier there. 4 islands in total, they mention. Sounds like a decent bit of variety in a launch title, to be fair. This page from N64 Magazine, blimey, proper retro this is, eh? It's all about Pilotwings 64, remember that one? A launch title for the N64, so back in 97 when everything was 3D and polygonal and blew your mind. The headline is Walking on Air Gyrocopter, so it's clearly focusing on the gyrocopter missions in the game. There are screenshots laid out, numbered 1 to 5 like a mini walkthrough. Each one has a little caption underneath giving you tips on how to handle the gyrocopter. Things like switching to first-person view for better aiming, using missiles for rockmen, those pesky targets, and generally just getting to grips with the controls. They say the gyrocopter is simple to control thanks to the analog stick, and yeah, it was pretty intuitive even back then. They even mentioned dives and firing missiles from underneath, which was quite the spectacle at the time, showing off the 3D graphics. Down on the right there's a section called JAS Stop, which is all about refueling your gyrocopter on Little States Island. Apparently there's a petrol station hidden in the wilderness, marked with a Paradigm logo, which is the developer, if I recall. You have to circle it to refuel. Bit of a faff, but realistic, I suppose. Then you've got Little States and Crescent Island sections underneath. Little States is all about the American-themed island, with all the famous landmarks crammed in. They're listing off things like the Statue of Liberty, Golden Gate Bridge, Empire State Building, Cape Canaveral, Grand Canyon, and even Mario carved into Mount Rushmore. Bit cheeky that last one, eh? They're saying it's really rather splendid to see it all in one go. Which yeah, for the time, it was pretty impressive to see those iconic places rendered. Blocky polygons and all. Crescent Island is described as deceptively difficult but with monstrous views. Sounds like they're saying it's a bit trickier to fly around, but worth it for the scenery. They compare it to Barbados, or the Isle of Wight, which is a bit of a contrast in exoticness, but hey, it's the N64 trying to be worldly. Overall, it's a pretty standard game guide page from back then. Enthusiastic about the game, highlighting the cool bits, and giving you some basic pointers to get started. ZY, the reviewer, seems to be enjoying the gyrocopter missions, even if he's being a bit sarcastic about the damnation of letting a rockman get away. Good times, good times. Makes you want to dust off the old N64, doesn't it? This page, right then, is from an old N64 Mag, issue 1 I reckon, back when the N64 was the shiny new toy. And it's all about secret stuff in Pilotwings 64, which, let's be honest, was a launch title that showed off what the console could do even if it was a bit, shall we say, sedate compared to Mario 64. So this article, see, is called The Birdman, and it's revealing these secret flight modes. Apparently, if you're not too busy with the proper missions, you can mess about with a hang glider. They're calling it Birdman, bit daft name really, but hey, it's the 90s. You use the A button to flap your wings and gain height, and B to land. Dead simple. And apparently the Z trigger changes the camera for taking happy pictures. Right then? Then there's something called stars in the skies. Apparently there are these Birdman stars dotted around the islands in the normal levels. If you collect 4 of them, you get whisked off to some secret Birdman game. They even show a picture of one of these stars, saying the one in Holiday Island is easy enough to find. Bet it wasn't that obvious back then without a guide though. Good Gorington. And before all that, there's a bit about the human cannonball, remember that? Bit of a laugh, getting fired out of a cannon. They've got all these angles and power settings, listed for each round, for 4 cannons in each of round 1, 2 and 3. Vertical angles, horizontal directions like west 50 degrees north, and full or half power settings. It's all there if you were that bothered about hitting the bullseye. Seemed a bit fiddly even then, but someone must have used it. The reviewer, ZY, pronounced Zai, apparently reckons Pilotwings 64 is good, calls it eye candy. Says it's got these jaw-dropping valleys and mountains. Bit much maybe, but it was a good-looking game for its time, I'll give them that. They mention these updated skydiving antics and say there are 36 main missions across 4 islands: Holiday, Crescent, Little States and Arctic. Sounds about right. Overall, it's a bit of a secrets page for Pilotwings 64. Probably quite exciting for someone back in '97 trying to squeeze every last bit of fun out of their new N64. Even if the Birdman mode sounds a bit, well, basic now, doesn't it? Still, good memories. This page showcases a review of Pilotwings 64 from back in the day, April '97 it seems, right at the start of the N64's life. It's a spread from N64 Magazine, issue 1 no less, so proper retro stuff. Core. The page is broken down into sections detailing the different game modes, starting with Human Cannonball, which they call an amusing take on the old circus routine. Sounds like a bit of a laugh, firing yourself out of a cannon into targets. They hint at some hidden targets and tricky aiming, typical N64 fare, making you work for it. Then there's skydiving, described as a tricky blighter. Apparently, you're matching your silhouette with green ones for formation flying. Sounds like a bit of a test of reactions, something to show off to your mates down the pub. Jumble Hopper is next, and this one looks properly bonkers. Springy soles and wellies, leaping about on skyscrapers. They say it's like Birdman levels but less soothing on the muscles. Madness, pure madness, but in a good way, right? I know. The accurate section talks about the in-air movement, and how precise it is, especially with the analog stick on the N64 controller. Remember how revolutionary that stick felt back then? Worlds away from D-pads, that's for sure. They mention gyrocopters and hang gliders, and even launching shuttles at Cape Canaveral. Quite the variety, it seems. There's a little, "It's a me, Wario," secret stuff box, saying you can change the face on the Mount Rushmore-esque mountain to Wario's face in the first Human Cannonball level. Cheeky little Easter egg, that's Nintendo all over. Down the side there's a flychart rating different aspects of the game for each vehicle. Things like turbulence and aeroplane food, bit of a daft chart really. More for flavor than serious analysis. The vehicles listed are hang glider, rocket belt, gyrocopter, Birdman, Human Cannonball, Skydiver and Jumblehopper. They've given Pilotwings 64 an overall score of 89%, calling it a breathtaking showcase for the N64. The verdicts for different aspects are shown as big colored blocks. Visuals gets a 9, sounds and mastery both get 8, and lifespan another 9. Difficulty is simply described as having one hell of a difficulty curve. Sounds like they were quite impressed then. Reviewer ZY, or Zai as we're supposed to say, seems properly chuffed with it. Good times, Good times. This page is from the first issue of N64 Magazine, and blimey, it's all about Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Remember that one? Big green letters shouting, Turok Dinosaur. It was supposed to be the big first-person shooter on the N64. You know, dinosaurs, instead of demons or space marines. They're talking about being drowned in blood, which sounds a bit much, but hey, it was the 90s. There are a couple of screenshots, one showing some massive green dinosaur bloke up close and personal, with a bit of health and ammo display, and the other showing some shadowy figures with spears, saying they are faster than your average Doom or Quake enemy. They weren't wrong there, those raptors were nippy little buggers. There's a little green box with some advice, saying if you are this close to a dino, you're probably in trouble, and even a tech arrow might not sort it out. Tech arrows, eh? Sounds futuristic for a dinosaur game, doesn't it? Gradute. Down at the bottom, there's a review type box. It's from Acclaim, naturally, and it's a whopping 128 megabit cartridge. That was a big deal back then, size mattered. It's got controller pack backup and cartridge backup just in case, and it's out now. And crikey, look at that price, minus £69.95. 69 quid and 95 pence. You could buy a week's worth of petrol for that back then. Games were pricey on the N64, weren't they? Oh, and there are these little badges. On the N64 video, an N64 star game. Must have been trying to give it some credibility right from the start. Issue 1 and all that. Good times, good times. This page is a look at Turok, Dinosaur Hunter on the N64, blimey, remember that? Big old green lizard face plastered across the top. Looks a bit rough around the edges, doesn't it? They've gone with a big yellow Hunter title, can't miss that, can you? It's an article reviewing the game, saying Acclaim were taking a risk bringing Turok to the N64. Risky? Maybe at the time, Nintendo were seen as the only ones who could really crack it on their own console. The reviewer reckons it's a proper good single-player game where you're this dark-skinned time traverser, a bit of a mouthful that, and you're hunting and harpooning your way through levels. 8 levels in each land, whatever that means. Sounds like a bit of a Doom rip-off if you ask me. Doom-style jaunt, they even call it, cheeky. You're after bits of a chronoceptor to defeat the campaigner, some bonkers villain with an army of bionosaurs. Bionosaurs? Core. They're really reaching, aren't they? Sounds like a right load of old nonsense, but in a good way, you know? There's a little screenshot down there, proper blurry like most N64 games were back then, showing some bloke with a gun in a tunnel, shooting at something a bit blobby and purple. They're saying taking enemies out at distance is the way to go, and you get to see the pyrotechnics, which probably means a few pixelated explosions. Still, back then this stuff was pretty impressive, wasn't it? Of course now you look at it and it's all a bit blocky. But in 97 this was the future, or so they wanted you to think anyway. April 97, it is at the bottom. Feels like a lifetime ago now. Good times, eh? This page in N64 Magazine, back from issue 1 in April 97 it seems, is all about weapons in Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Turok, remember that? Proper messy game that was, dinosaurs getting splattered, good times. Nui. They're calling it perfect weapon, and breaking down each tool of destruction Turok has. First up is the knife. Right, knife in a shooter, bit basic isn't it? But they're saying in the swampy levels, it's actually useful. Close combat neck slashes, the reviewer Zai reckons enemies will be begging for mercy. A bit strong maybe, but alright. Reebok. Then it's onto the bow and arrow. Standard fare, but they mention tech arrows that cause explosions. Ooh, fancy. Apparently good for blowing up raptors and those Joff Capesaurs, whatever they are. Still, Zai thinks you'll be back to the pistol pretty quickly. Always the way, innit? Rapt. Speaking of pistols, that's next. First proper weapon you get, apparently. Priceless little beauties, they call them. Effective for taking out limbs and making soldiers leer disturbingly. Charming. Probably best not to try taking on a Dimetrodon with just a pistol though, unless you're feeling particularly brave or stupid. There's a bit at the top about a Disco 2000 BC mode. Sounds a bit daft, they're saying it's for psychopaths. Apparently if you type in SNFFRR at the cheat menu you get dinosaurs doing Travolta moves. From Hulks to Triceratops all getting their boogie on. Foot soldiers shaking their bits to the hits. A bit much really, but each to their own I suppose. Down the bottom there's some chat about the controls. Analog stick for view, D-pad for direction. Apparently it's like PC games. Quake and Terminator. Future Shock, moving your head separate to your body, which was a bit of a novelty back then for consoles. They reckon it's a bit strange at first, but you get used to it. Overall, it's all about how much of a laugh Turok is, proper over-the-top violence and effects. They mention enemies flying through the air trailing blood, and the grenade launcher and particle accelerator, being particularly entertaining. Rightly so, they were pretty good fun. They do touch on the missed effects hiding clipping, saying it builds tension, especially when you see a silhouette. Yeah, it was moody alright. Good times, proper N64 launch title hype. This page from N64 Magazine, back in April '97, it's all about Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Remember that one? They're calling the assault rifle the perfect weapon. Bit strong maybe, but it was a step up from the pistol in that game, wasn't it? They say it doesn't take much thought to use, just point and spray, which is probably right, and makes for some well-timed carnage, as they put it. Then there's a section called Key to the Kingdom, which is about how you need to collect keys in each level to open up the warp portal at the end. Standard stuff really for the time, but they are making a point of saying you need to explore every inch to find them. Miss a key, and you are in trouble apparently, and miss out on the blood-swamped delights of the next level. Charming. There are a few screenshots dotted about, one of Turok letting rip with the assault rifle, another of a raptor rearing up. They're making a big deal about the realism of that, which is a bit funny now looking back, and another showing the assault rifle spraying blood, which they seem to approve of, saying it's nice. Ah, the 90s. There's also a screenshot of one of those blue warp portals, and they're being a bit sarcastic about game portals always being blue. It's a basic video game fact. TCH, cheeky Yacy. Down at the bottom they're talking about the game's atmosphere and level design, saying it's got everything from underwater canyons to claustrophobic corridors. They think it oozes atmosphere, and the puzzles are cleverly paced, which is fair enough, and they reckon you won't get lost, even though the save points are apparently a bit far apart. The reviewer, a chap called Tim, seems pretty impressed overall, saying it's got a Braveheart-style size to it and campaigner-style end-of-level bosses, whatever that means. He concludes by saying that Turok is brilliant and the best first-person shooter on any format. Bit strong, Tim, but we were all excited about these new N64 games back then, weren't we? This page from N64 Magazine, Issue 1, takes a look at some of the firepower you can expect in Turok, and blimey, it looks like they're going all out on the boomsticks, aren't they? They're calling them perfect weapons. Bit strong that, eh? Starting off with the bog-standard shotgun, which they reckon old Beaufort T. Justice himself would be proud of. Bit over the top, but alright. Apparently it's got a kick like Greenland, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but it'll sort out those bigger dinos, even if it takes a few blasts and you might get a dino smack for your trouble. They mention red explosive shells being the key to success. Good to know. Then we're on to the automatic shotgun, which they're comparing to Doom, naturally. Everyone was comparing everything to Doom back then, weren't they? They reckon it's a bit like a souped UP pump action, but with automatic fire and rapid fire. Sounds like a right handful. Apparently good for Jurassic bleeders, whatever they are. Next up is the chain gun, or chain gun as they've called it, and they're being a bit clever clogs, saying it doesn't fire chains. Thanks for clearing that up, lads. Sounds like this one really chews through the bullets, but it keeps going even after you stop firing, which could be handy, or a pain in the arse, depending. They say it packs a punch but slows you down, so swings and roundabouts, eh? Finally, there's the grenade launcher, which they're getting all Christmassy about, saying it's like Christmas come early. Bit much again, eh? They reckon it'll be good for taking out enemies on ledges, and it bounces around a bit at first, like rubber balls, before blowing up, so you'll have to get your timing right. Apparently good for scenery damage too, which was always a laugh back then. And on the side there's a little box warning about cheats, calling us evil cheater if we read on. Cheeky. They're basically saying there are cheats for Turok, but they don't want to spoil the fun if you're tempted to use them. A bit rich coming from a games mag, but fair enough I suppose. Overall, looks like Turok is going to be a right blastfest, just what you wanted for the N64 at the time, wasn't it? Big guns and dinos, can't go wrong really. This page from N64 Magazine is all about the weapons in Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, which was a pretty big deal back in April '97. They're calling it Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, in big letters down the side in case you missed it. First up they talk about the pulse rifle, saying it's like a rattlesnake, and the natural successor to the grenade launcher. Bit dramatic, isn't it? They reckon it's undoubtedly pretty to watch, but lacks the overall savagery of the grenade launcher. So, good looking but a bit soft maybe. Apparently it's easier to aim though, which is always helpful when you've got raptors breathing down your neck. They even give you a tip to line up your enemy from a nice long way off. Profound stuff that. Next it's the minigun. They're saying it truly defies its name, which is a strange way to start. Apparently it opens up like a particularly pleasing birthday present, each to their own I suppose. It's got powerful green lasers, which sounds very sci-fi. They say it consumes your prey in a blanket of green light and fries their weedy shapes. Bit over the top language, but it gets the point across. It's a powerful weapon. Good for outdoor pursuits apparently, so ideal for popping down the shops then. Finally, they're on to the quad rocket launcher. Taking a well-earned rest from the laser-fed weapons. As if firing lasers is such hard work. This one's more basics with four-way path of destruction. Sounds like a bit of a beast. They say the missiles are feisty and explode into a carpet of orange fire. Again, bit flowery for a rocket launcher. Accuracy is questionable apparently, but its effects are quite wondrous. So, maybe not the most precise tool, but makes a big mess, which is probably what you want. Down in the corner, they've got little captions like, "An unsuspecting enemy wanders up, and let fly." There may be a corpse left at the end of it all, but you'll have to look hard. Very helpful. Cheers N64 Mag. Then there's a bit called pen and ink mode. Apparently if you type in DLKTDR at the cheat menu, it turns the whole game into a set of untextured wireframes. Sounds interesting? They say it gives Iguana's game away somewhat, and the pop-up is just slightly suspect. Right then. But hey, as long as it doesn't happen in the game proper, eh? Good point, well made. Heckendell. So yeah, weapons in Turok. Pretty standard magazine fare for the time. Hyping up the new shooter. Bit of tongue-in-cheek, but mostly just trying to get you excited about blasting dinos. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1, back in April '97, is a look at Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, specifically at some of the rather tasty weaponry you could get your hands on. It's part of their N64 Arena section, which is quite fitting really. They're showing off 3 perfect weapons as they call them. First up is the Particle Accelerator, a bit of alien kit which they say is heavy and not easy to lug about, but packs a punch. Apparently, you hold down Z, give it a charge, and it unleashes blue lightning that freezes enemies and then shatters them. Sounds a bit tasty, doesn't it? They do warn you not to get too close when you fire it though, or you'll get zapped yourself. Next we've got the Fusion Cannon. This one's described as a Chernobylonistic. Bit strong perhaps, but they reckon it wipes out whole villages and leaves a half-mile radius of carnage with yellow smoke and shockwaves. Bit over the top really, but that's what we were after back then, wasn't it? Apparently you only get 2 shots with it, so best save it for the big lads. Worrying too. Finally, there's the Chronoceptor. This is meant to be Turok's ultimate weapon. You have to collect bits of it throughout the game, and it's a combo of the pulse rifle and minigun, with the power of the particle accelerator chucked in for good measure. They say it triples the damage and can abolish everything, including forests and settlements, so use it responsibly. There's a funny little quote from someone called Will who says he was quite scared when he first fired it and shook and quivered like a girl. Bit dramatic lads, but alright. Down the side they've got these little boxes giving it scores. Visuals and sounds both get an 8, mastery and lifespan get a 9. Overall verdict is a massive 91%, which is pretty darn good. They reckon Iguana, who made it, have breathed new life into a tired old genre, and that it's ludicrously violent, marvelously entertaining. Can't argue with that really. They're clearly quite impressed, saying it's another fantastic addition to the N64's growing library. There are a few screenshots dotted about showing the weapons in action, and a big picture at the bottom with Turok himself looking a bit rough and ready next to a massive dino. All in all, it's a pretty glowing preview, getting you well hyped for Turok hitting the N64. Made you want to rush out and get issue 2 straight away, didn't it? Especially as it says, "To be continued." Hey, you'd like a complete Turok guide, wouldn't you? It's in the next issue. Classic magazine trick to get you to buy the next one. This page from the magazine's Import Arena section, as you can see from the flags, is all about games from Japan and the US that you couldn't get here in Blighty just yet. It looks like they're kicking things off with a good look at Mario Kart 64, which even then everyone knew was going to be a system seller. They've got a couple of screenshots of the racing showing the karts zipping around what looks like a track, with a bit of a western theme to it, with the steamboat in the background. They mention that even though the characters are still sprites, they're much better looking and move about more smoothly than the old SNES game. The reviewer Zai even jokes that you won't see any blockiness, which is a bit of a dig at how things were back then, I suppose. Further down, they've got another screenshot showing a race in progress, with all the racers lined up and you can see their positions and lap times. It says each character has their own victory shouts and complaining groans, and they even pick out Wario's "thank you very much," which is a bit of a classic even now. There's a funny comment about Mario's moustache not helping him win races. Cheeky! Gah. Finally at the bottom they touch on the 4-player mode, saying it's incredibly fun, but you'd need 4 controllers, which back in '97, you had to shell out for separately naturally, and a massive telly, which were expensive enough as it was. Still, for Mario Kart 64, it was probably worth it. Imports were always a bit pricey, but for the chance to play the latest games before everyone else, especially something like this, well, it was tempting, wasn't it? This page depicts a review of Mario Kart 64 from back in the day, must be around April 97 going by the date at the bottom. Right in your face is Mario himself looking rather pleased with himself in his kart, and a sneaky Wario is lurking behind. It's all about the Japanese import version because, as they point out, us poor Brits wouldn't be getting our hands on it officially until June. Typical. They had to get their Japanese copy in early, didn't they? Rounded them up on Japanese import, they say. Sounds a bit dramatic for just buying a game early. It's 96 meg, which was quite something back then, and it's for 1 to 4 players, which is always good for a bit of a laugh with mates. They even give you the price in yen and a rough guide of £50, which was a fair whack for a game at the time. So yeah, Mario Kart 64, everyone was properly buzzing for this one, and of course the magazines were all over the import scene to get the scoop before anyone else. Good times, good times. This page from N64 Magazine, Issue 1, takes a look at Mario Kart 64, which was a pretty big deal at the time, naturally. Under the courses section, they're banging on about the different tracks you'll be racing on. Looks like they've picked out Luigi Circuit, which they say is a good starting track, and Moo Moo Farm, a more open farm-themed circuit, looks a bit like something out of Super Mario World if you squint. They mention the Grand Prix mode is made up of cups, each with 4 courses, and you need to finish in the top 4 to move on. A proper Formula 1 style point system apparently. Sounds alright. Then there's the drivers section, going through the characters. Mario and Luigi, they reckon they're your standard all-rounders, good for beginners. Yoshi, Princess Daisy, and Toad. They're the lightweights, nippy and good for handling, especially on twisty tracks, but lacking a bit in top speed, good for time attack mode they reckon. And then you have the big boys, Donkey Kong, Wario and Koopa. They're all about speed, the fastest on the track, but handle like a bathtub full of treacle apparently. They say they are good for Grand Prix mode as they can barge others off the track, but you'll struggle on tighter corners. There's a little box about speed start, talking about getting a boost at the start of the race if you time your accelerator press right, like in Super Mario Kart on the SNES. Also, a mention of mirror mode, which you get if you win gold on all the cups in 150cc, flipping all the tracks left to right. Sounds like a proper challenge, that does. Overall, it's a decent preview of Mario Kart 64, setting out the courses and characters and giving you a bit of an idea of what to expect. ZY, the reviewer, seems to think it's all shaping up nicely. Can't say I disagree, looked quite promising at the time. This page from the N64 magazine, harking back to April 97, is all about Mario Kart 64, proper good timing as we were all gagging for it back then. It's part of a feature called Kart to Kart, and it's mostly banging on about the multiplayer, which, let's be honest, was the whole point of the N64, wasn't it? They've got these little snippets describing the different player modes, from solo play, where apparently the computer cheats a bit. Well, surprise surprise, PAL player, to the legendary 4-player mode, which they're saying is like nothing else. Bit strong maybe, but yeah, it was pretty special. 2-player gets a mention with the added bonus of the battle mode. Good times were had in Block Fort, that's for sure. And then 3-player, where the CPU players apparently vanish into thin air and get replaced by bombs. Sounds a bit daft, typical N64 craziness. Oh boy. They've got screenshots of a few courses from the Flower Cup, like Noko Noko Beach, Kara Tara Desert, bit of a silly name that one, Canopio Highway, Frappe Snowland and Choco Mountain are also there, and good old Mario Circuit. Under courses Flower Cup, they're giving little tips like, avoid bananas, which is blindingly obvious, but hey, it's a tip nonetheless. Apparently, if you tap the brake, you won't spin out. Never knew that, or just ignored it in the heat of the moment probably. There's a best time section telling you how to show your time attack best time on the title screen, pressing R, who knew? And a race Nintendo bit, which is interesting. It's saying there are CPU ghost races of Luigi, Mario and Peach that you can unlock if you're fast enough in time attack. They even give you the times you need to beat for Luigi Circuit, Mario Circuit and Peach Circuit. 1 foot 52 inches, 1 foot 30 inches and 2 feet 40. Those sound like proper challenge times. Might have had a go at those back in the day maybe. All in all, it's a decent little preview page getting everyone hyped for Mario Kart 64 multiplayer, and rightly so because it was a proper laugh with your mates, wasn't it? This page from N64 Magazine, Issue 1 it looks like, is having a good old chinwag about Mario Kart 64. Right then, first up it's telling us about drift cornering. Seems if you want to be any good at this karting lark, you've got to press and hold R while going into a corner and waggle the stick. Apparently the smoke from your tyres spells out letters first versus then S. Fancy that. Warrington use. Then they're going through some of the tracks. Koopa Castle is apparently a right nightmare. Narrow doorways, lava sounds charming. And those thwomp things from Super Mario World are back. Great. Peach Circuit, the princess's own, naturally is supposed to be good for going around the outside of her castle. They reckon the chunkier characters like Wario and Donkey Kong will struggle with the fiddly bits. Makes sense. Sherbet Land is next, sounds a bit frosty. and they say it gets nasty with icy water and bananas and evil power-ups. Donkey Jungle Park, well, if the earlier tracks were sedate, this one apparently belts along. River in the middle, paddle steamer, jump, shortcut potential in a hairpin in a cave. Sounds a bit more exciting, to be fair. Last track they're talking about is Wario Stadium, described as a concentration-taxing 1,591 meters. Second longest track in the game apparently. Wide, slidey and jumpy, with power-ups everywhere. Good luck keeping on the track then. The whole middle bit is on time attack mode. Apparently it's the most intense way to play Mario Kart. You race on your own against the clock, trying to get the quickest time. They reckon it might sound dull, but it's actually alright once you get into it, trying to perfect your racing line and shave off hundredths of seconds. They say Nintendo are running some sort of championship in Japan, based around time attack on Mario Circuit, with prizes of special gold N64 controllers. Coring's gold controllers, eh? You'd need to be getting times of under a minute 30 seconds on Mario Circuit to even have a chance of winning one. They mention turbo starts, and using the 3 turbos you get wisely. Apparently Yoshi and Kinopio they mean Toad, obviously are good characters to use for this, Burrud. Down the side there are little tips in red boxes. One says by using the nippy Kinopio and power sliding, you can slice chunks out of Mario Circuit. Another one says by using Kinopio and power sliding constantly it's possible to slice chunks out of Mario Circuit. Hang on, that's the same tip twice, isn't it? Bit repetitive. And the last one says if you are really excellent you can liberate Mario's ghost, as described on the previous page, and then you must be beaten. Bit dramatic. Overall it's a decent little preview of Mario Kart 64, getting us all geared up for it. Sounds like they're quite impressed, especially with the time attack mode. And they seem to be pushing these drift cornering skills pretty hard. Right, better get practicing then. This page showcases Mario Kart 64, doesn't it? Looking back, it was a pretty big deal at the time, coming after the SNES version. They've got screenshots from a few of the racetracks here. First up is Yoshi Valley, which the review reckons Yoshi is right at home on, what with all the narrow paths and massive Yoshi egg to flatten you. Then there's Eudoro Pond, or Frappe Snowland as we probably called it, with rickety fences and spooky bats in the haunted house bit. Bit dramatic for a karting game, eh? Rainbow Road is there too, described as a real test, with those blinking bill things and bananas everywhere. Shortcuts near the jump apparently, always good to know. Over on the right, they've got the U1 bit, showing Peach's castle all done up with confetti after winning a cup. Can't skip it, they say, though I'm sure we all tried to back then. Right. Down below, they're going on about the battle game. Apparently Mario Kart on the SNES was loved for the 2-player battles, and this one on the N64 is for up to 4 players with bigger arenas. Balloons and power-ups popping other people's balloons, classic stuff. If you lose with more than 2 players you turn into a bomb. Sounds like a laugh. The reviewer, Zai I think they pronounce it, doesn't seem totally sold on the battle mode though, reckons the bigger arenas might make it less intense, or maybe they just prefer the Grand Prix and time trial modes. Says the Grand Prix and time attack are better than other games they've played, which is a decent enough compliment I suppose. And yeah, there are some little pictures of the battle mode arenas down the bottom. Looks like Luigi is the last one standing in one of the screenshots there. Under Jonathan's control it says. Ah, those were the days, eh? Simple pleasures, popping balloons in a blocky arena. This page from the N64 Magazine, issue 1, takes us back to April 97, blimey, feels like yesterday. It's all about Mario Kart 64, which was a pretty big deal at the time, wasn't it? It goes through the controls, saying they are incredibly subtle, with tricks to ferret out, which is a bit much. They're controls, not rocket science, but alright. Then there's a breakdown of the kart attacks, basically the power-ups. We've got your standard banana skins for dropping behind you, shells, green ones that bounce all over the place and red ones that home in. Classic. The spiky shell, or blue shell as we all know it now they call it, targets the race leader. Bit brutal that one, always caused a ruckus. Evil power-ups. Sounds ominous for just question mark boxes, doesn't it? Lightning shrinks everyone. Superstar makes you invincible. Ghost makes you invisible, and nabs other people's power-ups. Cheeky. Triple shells for orbiting your kart, and mushrooms for a speed boost. All the usual suspects. Power-Uppery is a bit of a weird title, but it's talking about how you get better power-ups if you are behind. Which is fair enough, keeps it interesting. And then there's a bit about outrageous cheating, saying the kart control is fine-tuned, and you've got to drive it more like a proper go-kart, power slides and all that. The review bit at the start, the bloke ZY seems quite chuffed with it, says it's fantastically good and the eagerly anticipated sequel to Super Mario Kart on the SNES. He reckons it might not look that special at first glance, especially compared to other N64 games, and the graphics aren't mind-blowing compared to what else was coming out on the system, which is a fair point. But he does say it's a proper Nintendo 64 game, that consoles that weren't N64s couldn't compete with. Bit of a bold statement that, maybe a tad over the top. But hey, it was the first issue, gotta make a splash, eh? All in all, a decent intro to Mario Kart 64, brings back memories of squabbling with mates over who got the blue shell and chucking controllers across the room in frustration. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, blimey, it's a look at Mario Kart 64. Right then, let's have a gander. Reckler. It's a review, isn't it? They've got screenshots splashed across the page showing off Moo Moo Farm with the cows and Noko Noko Beach, which I suppose we'd call Koopa Troopa Beach now, but Noko Noko sounds a bit more Japanese, doesn't it? You can see Mario, Luigi and Peach in their carts, looking all blocky but colourful, you know, N64 style. Chorange. The reviewer Jonathan seems pretty chuffed with it. He's talking about shortcuts on tracks like Kura Desert, which we'd call Kalimari Desert in the US version probably, and Noko Noko Beach. He mentions needing a star or a mushroom for a tunnel shortcut on Noko Noko Beach. Clever stuff. Says the graphics are alright, not mind-blowing but decent, and the sounds are jolly with good effects. Mastery's a 9, lifespan a 9 as well, so they reckon it'll keep you going. Accessibility is easy too, apparently, even with Japanese text, which is good for us Brits importing games back then. He bangs on about the drift cornering and the little touches like the cows and smoke when you skid, which is fair enough, they were quite good at that Nintendo, those little details. Talks about characters being sprites but rendered and digitized in a Donkey Kong Country style, which was the big thing at the time. Pre-rendered graphics. Speed is apparently spot on, even with 4 players. The Who's Karted bit is just him saying how much he likes Mario Kart and how this is even better. He mentions Shigeru Miyamoto and all that guff. Says it takes ages to master, which is probably true, and you can play time attack and multiplayer for ages. He even mentions a credit sequence with swooping cows and waterfalls. Sounds a bit bonkers. Right at the bottom, verdict is a big 91%. Extremely entertaining game, especially if you've got 4 controllers. Well yeah, 4 controllers, who had 4 controllers back then? They were blinking expensive. But yeah, Mario Kart, it was a laugh, wasn't it? He says Jonathan at the bottom of the review, so I suppose that's his name. And it's April 1997 at the bottom right. Crikey, time flies. To be continued, it says, with something about a PAL Mario Kart review in the summer. Sounds like they're gonna milk this Mario Kart thing for all it's worth. Can't blame them, it was a good game, mind. This page is a review of Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey for the N64 from back in the day, issue 1 of N64 Magazine, crikey, 1997. It's got that import arena banner at the top, showing it was probably a game we had to wait a bit longer for in the UK. The review's got a typical N64 mag style, with these little boxes down the side, visual, sounds, mastery, lifespan, and then the verdict. Visually, it gets a 7, saying, smooth 3D animation but few frills. Sounds get a question mark. Bilious music, obviously, but good effects. Mastery is a 6. Excellent animation, but a little low on detail and some jerkiness. Lifespan also a 6. Well, we're bored of it, but those still playing NHL will find this better. A bit harsh, maybe? The main bit of text talks about how players smack into each other, sticks get tangled, and pucks ricochet all over the place. All that typical hockey chaos. Apparently, it's more real than what had been on PC or PlayStation. They mention the chunky 3D graphics and touches like the puck trails and exaggerated collisions. The reviewer Jonathan reckons it's more of an arcade-style game rather than a proper simulation, which is fair enough for an N64 game of that era. There's a section about invisible players. Apparently if you pause and go to replay and choose a player and press Z, they disappear and you repeat to taste. Bit odd, but typical cheat code stuff back then. And mutant players. Sounds even weirder. You hold C button on the options screen and press R and 16 zeros appear. And you can mess with player head, body and height using the C buttons. Madness. Kirigo. There's a little table showing it's a 64 meg cartridge, 14 players, controller pack backup. Out now in the US and UK release TBA. Price was $80, about £50, which was a fair whack for a game then. There's a screenshot showing the game from a kinda top-down angled view, all very 3D polygony. Another one shows a close-up of a player's face, and yeah, they do look a bit well, as the caption says. The frightening thing is, this is what hockey players actually look like. Cheeky, Warrington my. The verdict section, verdict T, in big yellow letters, gives it 70%. Fast-moving, violent and intense. Ice hockey, as it's meant to be played. ZY, sorry Jonathan, at the bottom. X. Overall, it sounds like a decent, if not groundbreaking, hockey game for the N64. Probably quite fun for a blast with mates, but maybe not the deepest simulation out there. 70%, solid enough score I suppose. It's funny looking back at these old reviews, makes you remember what gaming was like back then. This page showcases the Import Arena section from what must be the first issue of N64 Magazine back in '97. And blimey, it's all about Killer Instinct Gold. Remember that? Everyone was buzzing for it. The headline is a bit daft. Held backwards, 2 N64 joypads can become deadly claws. Roar! Clearly trying to ramp up the excitement for multiplayer. Looking at the screenshots, you've got all the classic KI characters doing their thing. Spinal looking like his usual skeletal self. Fulgor being all robotic and menacing. And there's Jago, Orchid, Tusk, Glacius, even Combo and Maya in there. They're showing off the combos and special moves, you know the drill, ultimate finishes and all that. There's even a bit about a rumoured naked Orchid fatality, which sounds exactly like the kind of playground gossip you'd get back then. Apparently, old Sam Tweed in Lincoln is going to demonstrate an ultimate finish, bless him, and a tip on how to do Maya's Mammoth Forahat fatality. Lovely stuff. The main article, just called Killer, seems to be a review of sorts. ZY, the reviewer, pronounced Zai apparently, which is a bit poncy. Reckons that after the groundbreaking Super Mario 64, KI Gold is a bit of an unambitious echo. Ouch. They're saying it's an obligation rather than something genuinely amazing. They're not pulling any punches, are they? Talking about jerky animation and dumpy KI2 redesigns. Bit harsh maybe, we were probably just happy to have it on the N64 at the time. They do admit it's got some heritage, nicking bits from Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, which, to be fair, most fighting games did back then. The info box says it's a 64 meg cartridge, 1 to 2 players, needs a controller pack for saves, and was going to set you back about 50 quid imported or $80 in Yankee land, and was due out in the UK in June. Crikey, those import prices were something else. The screenshot captions are pointing out little visual details, scaled out views, choppers flying by in the background, Glacius doing his drippy ice thing, interactive backgrounds and bits of buildings getting smashed up. All the usual bells and whistles for a 90s fighter, really. Still, brings back memories of hammering those N64 controllers, doesn't it? This page is a review of Killer Instinct Gold from back in the day, April '97 it seems, so around the time the N64 was still quite fresh. It's talking about Killer Instinct Gold, obviously, and how it's all about learning those massive combos, which was pretty much the point of the original Killer Instinct on the SNES as well, wasn't it? The review's called Newbie Forte, which is a bit cheeky, suggesting it's easy to pick up, even though it's all about mastering the combos. There are a few screenshots scattered about. One shows Tusk fighting Orchid, looking rather blocky, but hey, that was the style at the time, with these per-rendered graphics. Another one has Gargos, that winged demon fella, against Maya, down in some kind of dungeon. And there's one with Jago doing his fireball move, which the review calls a quarter circle of joy. Bit dramatic, isn't it? Kim Woo gets a mention. Apparently she got done in by a training pole, bless her. The reviewer, this ZY chap pronounced Zai, apparently seems a bit on the fence. He says it's good for showing off with long combos, maybe a bit too much emphasis on that instead of proper tactics. Says it was a tasty slice of violence pie, as a SNES conversion, which is a bit of a backhanded compliment, isn't it? They're saying the graphics are a bit curtailed on the N64, and the sound, while CD quality, is sometimes wasted on sub-disco mediocrity, whatever that means. Mastery gets a middling 5 out of 10, reckon it's more SNES than N64, in terms of depth. Lifespan is also a 5, saying you'll be bored after a couple of months. Ouch. Verdict is, guaranteed to please fans of the coin-op, and nobody else. Pretty harsh. Overall they give it 62%, which isn't brilliant, is it? Seems like they're saying it's alright for what it is, a home version of the arcade game, but nothing amazing, and probably won't keep you hooked for ages. Fair enough, there were a lot of fighting games around at the time, weren't there? Tekken, Virtua Fighter, Mortal Kombat, all vying for your attention and pocket money. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1 it is, takes a look at J-League Perfect Striker. Apparently it's going to be called ISS64 when it hits Europe. Seems they reckon it's going to be incredibly good, which is a bold claim, isn't it? There are a few screenshots here showing the game in action. Looks like your typical football affair. Bit blocky, mind you. Even for the time, they're making a fuss about goalkeepers being more involved, saying you can control them like some sort of nouveau grobbelaar. Apparently they can do a back pass now and get stuck in, which sounds like a recipe for disaster if you ask me. There's also talk about penalty shootouts being improved with a wandering targeting sight, making it sound a bit more interesting than just blasting it and hoping. The box details are there. 64 megs cartridge, needs a controller pack for backup, typical Konami. Price is around 50 quid, which was a fair wedge back then. Says it's out now, UK release in June. So we'd be waiting a bit for this one then. Quaranta. Oh, and look, Stargame logo, And on the N64 video too. Always had those bits and bobs in magazines back then, didn't they? All in all, it's a preview that's trying to get us excited for this Japanese footy game. We'll see if it lives up to the hype when it finally lands, eh? This page from N64 Magazine, back in April '97, is having a look at Perfect Striker. Remember that one? It was meant to be a bit of alright football game on the N64, and this article seems to be focusing on how realistic it tries to be. They're going on about the refereeing being strict, even down to giving you stick for mouthing off and flashing yellow cards like they're going out of fashion. Apparently the refs are proper jobs worth, or as they put it, a little Hitler with his notebook. Bit strong that, even for back then. There's screenshots showing yellow cards being brandished, so you get the idea. Cool. Then there's a section about the crowd noise, calling it crowd control. They're saying most footy games just have the same old boring chants. But Konami, being Konami, have gone and done something a bit more fancy. This response sound system they've come up with makes the crowd react to what's actually happening on the pitch. So if it's a dull game, the crowd goes quiet, but if you do something good, they go mental apparently. Proper knees-up versions of chants and cheering, like they're really getting into it. They even compare it to their baseball game, Power Pro Baseball 4, reckon it's as good as that for sound. Sounds alright if a bit much for a footy game. War. Down at the bottom they're showing off some screenshots of goal celebrations, saying there's at least 10 different ones. They look alright, bit basic by today's standards, proper blocky polygons of course, but for the time, it probably looked pretty decent. One bit mentions the goalie yelling at his teammates to get upfield when they're losing, like he's some kind of tactical genius. Another bit talks about how only a miracle can save the keeper in one of the screenshots. Bit dramatic. You can see players like FW Nagoya Grampus on the screen, with Japanese names, so it's definitely got that proper Japanese football vibe. New. Overall, it seems like they're quite impressed with Perfect Striker for trying to be a bit more than just your average button basher, especially with the crowd stuff and referee bits. Whether it was actually any good to play, well that's another question, isn't it? But back then on the N64, you took what you could get, didn't you? This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1, takes us right back to April '97. It's an import arena feature, and this time they're looking at a Japanese football game called Perfect Striker. Right then, football games on the N64, exciting times. Woo. The page is laid out with a decent chunk of text reviewing the game, alongside a few screenshots. You can see the gameplay looks fairly typical for the time, a top-downish perspective on the pitch. One shot shows the scoreline at 12, with a Japanese team badge, and another has a clock showing second 03, so late in the game drama perhaps. There's even a little box with GK 1 inch and Japanese text. Must be showing the goalkeeper. Down below, another screenshot shows a goal being scored, saying victory was secured by nailing the opposing goalie's boot to the ground. Bit dramatic that. The reviewer, a ZY pronounced Zai, apparently seems pretty impressed overall, giving it an 89% verdict. He's raving about the intricate mechanics and calling it the finest interpretation of football currently available on any format. Bit strong, isn't it? He mentions it being like International Superstar Soccer Deluxe ISSD, we all knew that one, but reckons this is even better. He talks about the glorious motion capture and manic Japanese commentary. Sounds like they went all in. There are little boxes down the side giving scores for different bits. Accessibility is marked down a bit, because the tactics screens are a pain for us Brits, needing a scrape through. Visuals get a 9, sounds an 8, mastery an 8, and lifespan a 9. Lifespan 9. That's a good sign, eh? Means it'll keep you going. He mentions the controls being easy to pick up, but that expert players will want to get into the yellow directional buttons. Sounds a bit complicated, but maybe that's where the depth is. He does say scoring is brilliantly dealt with, but also that it's too easy to score. Apparently you can run up double figures easily, which doesn't sound very realistic, does it? He also notes the goalkeepers are a bit dodgy, letting in some soft goals. Classic football game AI issues, eh? Ria. He finishes off by saying Perfect Striker isn't flawless by any means, but it's certainly as close a rendering of football there's been on any format. And then finishes with, time to change your allegiance perhaps, Tim. Bit cheeky. Overall though, sounds like this Perfect Striker game was a decent shout for footy fans on the N64 at the time, even if it was a bit importy and maybe a tad too easy to score. Good score though, 89%, can't sniff at that. This page is having a bit of a chinwag about footy games, as you do. It seems J-League Perfect Striker is out on import, which sounds a bit like hard work to be honest, all in Japanese and that. Apparently the menus are a bit baffling too, unsurprising really, but they reckon if you can hold your horses until June, we'll be getting International Superstar Soccer 64. Now that sounds more like it. They're saying ISS64 will basically be J-League Perfect Striker, but without all the Japanese commentary and menus, and with proper European teams instead, which is good news, because let's be honest, who really knows much about Japanese footy teams back then? They mentioned the old SNES, International Superstar Soccer, which that was a decent game, wasn't it? Better than some of the clunky efforts we'd seen before ISS came along. FIFA was always a bit rigid, and Striker was just a bit odd. ISS was smooth and responsive, and apparently this N64 version is going to be even better. There's a screenshot of the options screen, looks fairly standard, your leagues and cups and that, and another picture showing the coin toss at the start of a game. Remember when that was a fancy thing in games? They even mention Konami's Major A team are beavering away at the conversion to get it ready for June. Sounds promising, fingers crossed it's a proper good footy game for the N64. We could certainly do with one. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 1 it is, takes us behind the scenes with the fellas at Konami, who made International Superstar Soccer 64, or ISS64 as we all called it back then. It's an import arena feature, so it's all about games from Japan, which were always a bit exotic and exciting back then, weren't they? The article is titled, Meeting the Major A Team, by Jonathan Davies. We get a picture of the Konami chaps themselves, looking very serious in their matching brown jackets. Apparently they are from the Osaka R&D department, and the team consists of Fumimasa Katakami, who is in charge of graphics, Eiji Nakagawa, who does the player AI, and Yasuo Okuda, who's the team head and programming whiz. They are talking about how ISS64 is meant to be Sega's Victory Goal's rival. Victory Goal was alright, a bit blocky though, wasn't it? They reckon ISS64 is a 32-bit soccer game, which sounds impressive, but everything was bit this and bit that back then, wasn't it? The interview touches on their design choices. Apparently they looked at Perfect Striker for ideas too, which was another footy game. They wanted realistic motion and playability, focusing on analog control and giving you control of all 11 players. They used motion capture, but had to break it down to make it more playable, rather than just super realistic looking but clunky controls, which is fair enough. They even motion captured a student footballer, resourceful. The screenshots show the game in action, Germany versus Brazil in one, and France playing Brazil in another, with Thierry and Santos named, proper players there. The in-game graphics look, well, very N64. You can see the blocky polygons and blurry textures, but at the time, this was cutting edge, or so we thought. They mention player morale being shown with ball faces, which sounds a bit bonkers, and tactical substitutions being important. One bit I chuckled at was the programmer saying, 16-bit machines are, he trails off, classic. Sounds like they were finding the N64 a bit more of a beast to program for than they let on, despite it supposedly being all 64-bit amazingness. Overall, it's a good little preview piece, setting the scene for ISS64. It's interesting to hear from the developers and what their aims were. Back then, reading this in '97, it would have definitely got you hyped for another footy game on the N64, especially if you were a big fan of the beautiful game and a bit bored of the usual suspects. This page in N64 Magazine is previewing J-League Perfect Striker Extra, which is essentially becoming International Superstar Soccer 64. The chaps from Konami, Mr. Okuda, Nagae and Nakagawa, are being interviewed. Apparently FIFA's licensing is causing a headache, so ISS64 has to use made UP player names, but they assure us they are jolly good. They are rather pleased with themselves for using motion capture for Perfect Striker, hence the smoother player movement, judging by the screenshots. They're going on about how N64 cartridges are superior to the PlayStation's CDs for speed, always good for a kickabout. There's mention of a 6.4DD version, but it sounds more like wishful thinking at this stage. ISS64 is getting all the bells and whistles over Perfect Striker though, national teams, player looks, new grounds, the lot. They're even trying to sort out the slower PAL speed for us Europeans, which is thoughtful. 75 pages of commentary on a cartridge? Blimey, that's chatty. Apparently the N64's AI is light years ahead of the SNES, which could be interesting. They're even changing the difficulty for us supposedly more hardcore European gamers. The reviewer, ZY, had a right old carry-on moment trying to blag a game of ISS64, involving a dodgy toilet excuse and security guards. Still, he cornered some Konami bigwig about upcoming N64 titles before getting the boot. They're promising a proper review of ISS64 in June. Motion capture and polygons in a football game. It might just be alright, mightn't it? This page is all about Mortal Kombat Trilogy coming to the N64, back in '97 when we were all gagging for new games on the console, weren't we? It seems like the Yanks were getting it first, typical. The article is written by Zai, if I'm reading that correctly. He's talking about how Mortal Kombat has been around for ages, since the days of Street Fighter 2, and this trilogy game is supposed to be the ultimate MK experience, pulling in bits from all the previous games like Mortal Kombat 1, 2, 3, and even Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, T. He's mentioning the aggressor mode as something new, where you fill up a meter and go a bit mental like a powered-up version of your fighter. Sounds a bit like Street Fighter's Super Meter, doesn't it? There's a screenshot showing Scorpion and Kitana battling it out with Finish Her. On-screen classic Mortal Kombat cheesiness, you gotta love it. Another one shows Raiden doing his flying kick move. Warrings. Zai's not exactly blown away by it though, is he? He reckons it's a bit lazy, not really pushing the N64 at all. He even says the sound is muffled, like it was recorded in a dirty washing basket. Bit harsh maybe, but he's got a point. The N64 was supposed to be a powerhouse. He's saying it's not even as good looking as the PlayStation version, missing animation frames and all. Still, he admits there are loads of fighters to pick from, and the special moves are still there, even if he thinks it's a bit of a missed opportunity for the N64. There's also a bit about the N64 controller not being ideal for Mortal Kombat, saying it's a bit fiddly to pull off combos, especially if you've got fat hands. Cheeky. But yeah, those C buttons could be a bit of a stretch sometimes, couldn't they? Overall, it sounds like he's a bit disappointed with this N64 version of Mortal Kombat Trilogy, calling it bleeding terrible in one of those little speech bubble captions. Ouch! But hey, we were still gonna play it, weren't we? It's Mortal Kombat after all. This page depicts a review of Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the N64 from back in the day, April '97 it seems. Blimey, issue 1 of N64 Magazine, how about that? Right then, Shikano take no more, Captain. A bit of a cheeky title there, playing on Kano I suppose, for a game that's apparently a bit naff. Marcus is the reviewer, and he's not holding back. He kicks off saying the SNES version of Ultimate Mortal Kombat is better, which is a bit of a downer straight away for the 64-bit version, innit? He does grudgingly admit the N64 version has no loading times, which was a plus at the time, compared to the PlayStation and Saturn I suppose. The screenshots show Sonya and Shang Tsung, then Killer Instinct Gold with Fulgore and Kim, then Kano and Shang Tsung again in what looks like two-player mode, and lastly Scorpion and Rain battling it out. We're told you can have two fighters at once, which sounds a bit chaotic, but you only get one life each. Marcus reckons if you've got a PlayStation you're better off playing the PlayStation version. Ouch. He then mentions a load of other beat-em-ups coming out soon like Killer Instinct Gold, War Gods, Street Fighter 3, Dual Heroes, Mace, Dark Rift and even 64 Uzumo, saying you'd be a gibbon to get MK Trilogy with all those other choices coming. Bit harsh, mate. The review breaks down the scores. Visuals get a measly 4 out of 10, saying it's not as crisp as the PlayStation but has some nice transparency effects. Sounds get a shocking 2 out of 10, called absolute guff with dull speech and effects that you have to crank the volume up to hear. Mastery gets a 0/0, apparently feeling like it was made for another console, and they mention Super Mario and Turok as examples of games that feel properly N64. Lifespan gets an 8 out of 10 though, because there are 5 difficulty settings and 4 different endings, which is something I suppose. Overall verdict? A dismal 34%. Vastly overrated, and a poor use of the N64's powers. Strong words, saying it's best avoided. So yeah, sounds like Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the N64 was a bit of a dog's dinner then, according to Marcus. Right then, moving on. This page in the N64 Mag, issue 1 it is, goes into the glory of St. Andrews for the N64. Right then, so they're giving some gameplay tips at the start, saying to check out the player config screen before you start, and that bunker shots need a good dig under the ball. Accessibility-wise, it's a bit Japlish apparently, but they reckon the picture icons help you figure it out. Visually, Burrington Mill-wise, well they say hardly anything good, basic visuals, even break some rules, doesn't sound great. Sounds are apparently Game Boyish, limited effects and dodgy speech. Mastery is a 4 out of 5, saying it's a bit dated looking and slow, not really pushing the N64. Lifespan gets a 6, courses aren't amazing, but mastering the controls might keep you going a bit. The verdict then, a 58%. They reckon it looks like a travesty but plays alright, but N64 Golf deserves a better game. The main article calls it, The Glory of St. Andrews, a bit of a dramatic title for this, eh? Seems they found it underwhelming. They mention visual atrocities, dodgy collision detection, and the player model doing weird things. On the plus side, they talk about the analog stick control being a virtual golf club, pulling back, and pushing forward to swing. The little table at the bottom says it's by SETA, 64 meg cartridge, 1 to 4 players, controller pack for saving. Says out now but UK release unlikely, and about £50 import price. Ouch. So, not exactly sounding like a must-have then, is it? This page depicts a review of Cruisin' USA for the N64. Right there on the page in big red letters. Ah, Cruisin' USA. Remember that one? It was supposed to be the next big arcade racer on our shiny new N64. They were pushing it as the alternative if Mario Kart wasn't your cup of tea. Bit of a cheek really comparing it to Mario Kart, wasn't it? The reviewer, Jonathan, doesn't seem too impressed, to be honest. He's given it a right kicking, only 34%. Ouch. Says it's basically solid but a pale shadow of the much better Mario Kart. I remember the hype, but yeah, looking back, Mario Kart 64 was in a different league. He's banging on about the garnish palette of colours and the cartoon-like crashes, which, fair enough, it was trying to be a bit over-the-top arcade style. He even says it's only challenging because the controls are a bit rubbish. Nudge the stick gently, he says. Sounds like he's struggling a bit. He gives it 5 out of 5 for visuals but calls them pretty awful. Bit of a contradiction there, maybe he's being sarcastic. Really dreadful music, gets a 4 for sounds, 26 minutes. Lifespan is a bit brutal, and a 3 for mastery. Doesn't sound like he's recommending rushing out to buy it. There's also a little section at the side with extra vehicles, saying you can get a police car, jeep and a school bus by holding a bunch of buttons at the car selection screen. School bus racing, that does sound a bit daft, even for the time. Then there's another bit, completely unrelated, about golf, the hallway guide for the riggers of St Andrews. Seems to be giving tips for a golf game, probably a different one entirely, talking about tee-offs with a hefty wood and fairways and greens. They even talk about Trouse, a victim of a golf player, getting excited. Bit weird. Sounds like your typical golf game advice. Select your club, don't overhit, putting is tricky, that sort of thing. Doesn't seem to be linked to Cruisin' USA at all, just a random golf game article squeezed in. Overall, it looks like a bit of a mixed page, focusing mainly on tearing Cruisin' USA apart and a very brief guide to playing a golf game, presumably on the N64 as well. Definitely remember Cruisin' USA being a bit of a letdown at the time. Mario Kart really did spoil us, didn't it? This page depicts a review from the first issue of N64 Magazine, April 1997, covering 2 games, Mahjong Master and NBA Hangtime. First up, we've got Mahjong Master. Now, I remember seeing this advertised and thinking, Mahjong on the N64? It's a Japanese import, naturally, with text in Japanese, so the accessibility score of 1 out of 5 is no surprise. You really needed to know your tiles already. Visually, it gets a decent 3, jolly nice rendered tiles, they say, and sound is a 5, which is quite high, praising the late-night Radio 2 style sounds, and click-click of little plastic things. Mastery and lifespan get a 4 and 6 respectively, hinting that it's a deep game you can get lost in for a long time if you're into that sort of thing. The verdict is a 69%, which is, well, okay, I suppose. The reviewer ZY, pronounced Zai, says, okay, so it's Mahjong. What's so wrong about that, eh? Which is fair enough. It's Mahjong, and if you like Mahjong, this is probably a decent version. The screenshots show typical Mahjong gameplay, with some rather stern-looking character portraits, which is all part of the charm in it. They even mention the Mahjong Groove Network. Sounds a bit cheesy even for back then. Then there's NBA Hangtime. This one's a bit more up my street. It's the Williams-Bally Midway version, so you know it's going to be arcadey. Visually, it gets a 3 old-style 2D, but great animations and smart reflections. Sounds gets a 5, bursting with effects and commentary. Mastery of 4 2D isn't exactly N64, but it's just like the coin-op, and lifespan of 6, we'll never be playing it again. Which is a bit harsh, but maybe they're a bit tired of basketball games in the office that week. The verdict is a 52%, a bit low really, described as excellent basketball, but we'd rather play football. Bit of a damning verdict there. The reviewer, Jonathan, felt it was a bit too similar to the Mega Drive version, which was already out and about. He also moans about playing against the computer, and how predictable it can be. He ends by saying, so sorry America, we'll take Perfect Striker, and you can keep your basketball game. Ouch! The screenshots show the classic NBA Jam-style action with those big-headed players, which was all the rage in arcades at the time. Gesture. Overall, a pretty standard first-issue review page really. One import game for the hardcore puzzle fans and an arcade sports conversion that didn't quite hit the mark for these N64 reviewers. Seems they were holding out for something a bit more groundbreaking for their shiny new console. This page reviews Wonder Project J2 for the N64. It's described as a bit of an oddity, more of an interactive cartoon than a proper RPG, coming from Enix back in the day. The premise is you're supposed to be a father figure to Josette, this naive robot girl, with no prior dad experience needed, which is handy. Gameplay is based on praising or chastising her to guide her development and see if she becomes a real girl. Sounds a bit touchy-feely for a game, doesn't it? Graphically, they reckon the 2D artwork is decent, but the 3D bits are a bit ropey, which wasn't uncommon on the N64 in its early days, was it? Promises of 3D often outstripped reality. Sounds are described as twee tunes that are unlikely to get you moving, so not exactly a musical masterpiece then. Mastery is rated low, a 3 out of 10, but lifespan is a 7, suggesting it's easy enough to pick up, but might take a while to complete. Accessibility mentions needing to understand Japanese girls and kanji, which, to be fair, was a real barrier for a lot of imported games back then. Overall verdict is a rather lukewarm 55%. The reviewer, ZY, pronounced Zai, apparently calls it an interesting attempt, but says it doesn't quite come off. So not a must-have then, more like one you might have picked up cheap in a bargain bin later on, if you were curious. This page is a review of the Nintendo 64 game, King of Pro Baseball. It's in that import arena section of the magazine, you know, back when we were all desperate for anything new on the N64, and imports were a bit of a gamble but exciting at the same time. War? So, King of Pro Baseball, right? The reviewer, ZY, which they helpfully tell you to pronounce Zai, reckons it's the first N64 game they've had a proper go on, and calls it a frightening monster treatment. Bit dramatic, eh? Apparently the players look a bit odd, cartoonish, with humongous head, cucumber eyes and fat little legs. Sounds charming. They reckon the tactical screens are good, loads of options and strategies, which is always welcome. They mention the pitching is alright, but batting can be a bit much for even the most patient player. The real kicker, according to ZY, is the slow pace of the players running to first base. Says it's like Torture Reservoir Dogs reveled in. Okay, bit over the top, but we get the idea. They also moan about the yellow buttons confusing things when you're trying to run the bases. Warra. There are a few screenshots dotted around. One shows a batter up at home plate, another a close-up of one of these fat-headed players. Looks, well, very Japanese, doesn't it? Another picture shows a screen with lots of text. Probably one of those impenetrable menus they mention in the accessibility box, which they've marked a 2 out of 7, saying the options are impenetrable. Ouch, Jelsei. The review boxes give it 7 for visuals and sounds, saying the sound has a manic Japanese commentator, which, yeah, sounds about right for an import. Mastery gets a 4, lifespan a 7, fun with 2 players, but the faults show up eventually. And the overall verdict score is 68%. Initially great fun, but the longer you play, the more annoying the players become. Harsh but fair, maybe? They conclude saying it's a worthy attempt, but probably only for fanatical followers of the sport, and not worth £50, which even back then felt like a lot for an import game. So probably one to skip unless you were really desperate for a baseball game on the N64 and had a few quid to burn. This page is like a blast from the past, straight out of N64 Magazine, issue 1 no less, back in '97. It's a tips page, crammed with little nuggets of info for some of the N64 launch window games. First up, there's a section called New High Score. Apparently this bloke called James, or ZY as they call him in the mag, reckons he's proper good at Shadows of the Empire. So good in fact he's getting a bit bored of it. They even put a challenge out for readers to beat his time on the Battle of Hoth level, offering a SuperPad Plus as a prize. Remember those? Spectra video things, trying to be all ergonomic. Renew. Then we get into the game tips themselves. There's Cruisin' USA, with a nitrous boost cheat code. Sounds a bit convoluted, involving flashing lights and holding dialogue left for ages. Seems like a bit of faff for a boost, but back then we'd try anything, wouldn't we? They've got a list of names next to the cheat inputs: Stonehenge, Street, Dungeon, Bridge, Spinal Ship, Dojo, no idea what they are. Maybe different stages or cars in the game? Boring doughy. Next is Killer Instinct Gold. They're talking about 100% combos. Sounds like a right cheap trick. Basically you set the early ultimates option to on, and then rinse your opponent until they're almost dead, then you can apparently pull off some massive combo. Slightly unsporting, but hey, whatever gets you the win, right? They mention turning off knockdowns and cheap juggles too. Serious stuff. Pilot Wings 64 gets a look in with star locations and refuel vehicles. They tell you where to find stars on Holiday Island, Crescent Island and Little States Island. And a tip for free fuel near the nuclear power plant in Little States Island, if you fly under a petrol station roof, with a rocket pack or gyropter. That's actually quite useful, saves you hunting around for fuel pads all the time. There's also something about maximum score on Jumble Hopper. Mission 3. involving teleporting near the end of the level for max points. Sounds like a bit of a glitch exploit. Finally, there's Wave Race 64. A simple one here. Same colored racer in 2-player mode. This one's for playing with your mate, and it's a way to both be the same color racer. You have to mess around with the controllers and start at the same time. Bit of a faff to set up, but if you really want it to be the same color, there you go. Prinzy. Overall, it's a typical tips page from back then. A mix of cheats, glitches, and genuine helpful hints. All a bit basic really. But gold dust when you were stuck on a game and didn't have the internet to look things up instantly. Brings back memories of poring over these pages, trying to get an edge on your mates. This page depicts a good old page of cheat codes and tips, proper retro stuff. It's all about Mortal Kombat trilogy on the N64, remember that one? Midway, of course, they were the kings of gore back then. So at the top we've got Ultimate Combat codes. These were all the rage, weren't they? Entering these mad combinations of numbers at the attract screen. It says here you just rotate your joystick, clockwise once or twice. Madness. Looking at some of these codes, you've got Bloody Combat, Combat Zone, Jade's Desert, No Fear, Flipper Message. Flipper Message? What was that even about? And Skunky, classic. Then there's Ed Boon Message, referencing one of the creators. They always loved their little secrets, didn't they? Next up is Shao Kahn's Treasures. Oh yeah, this was a goodie. Beating the game on different towers to unlock these. Top row is things like Ending, Fight Ermac, Fatality Demo 2. Bottom row's got Play Pong, Male Ninja Combat, Friendship Demo 1, Fatality Demo 4, and Play Space Invaders. Space Invaders in Mortal Kombat? What a time to be alive! It tells you here which treasures you get depending on if you completed the Novice, Warrior, or Master Tower. Good luck with the Master Tower, blimey, that was tough. EO. Below that, unlimited credits. Thank goodness for these codes back then, eh? D, D, U, U, R, R, L, L. Simple enough. A noise if you did it right, and free play. Sorted. There's a screenshot of some combat action with Raiden fighting Nightwolf. Looks pretty standard MK fare. Lots of blood and pixelated punches. Bull. Then, Johnny Cage's 3-head punch-off. Right then, another finishing move secret. Hold HP, BLK and LP all at once during the head punch-off fatality. 3 heads. These fatalities were getting more and more ridiculous, weren't they? And, exploding babies. Perform the babality, and then hold HP, LP, HK, and LK. Babies exploding. Only in Mortal Kombat. Great. Canays. Down at the bottom left it's secret stunts. Double flip stunt, helicopter into flip stunt, and triple flip. All about getting points for doing flips off ramps. Over 2,000 points if you get it spot on for the double flip. A whopping 3,000 points for the triple flip. They make it sound almost impossible. Remember spending ages trying to nail these, probably crashing into the water half the time. Finally, your top 10 tips, and a form to send your own tips in to N64 Magazine. Found an interesting cheat tip, secret bit or quirky thing to do? They were after the best of the best. A flash N64 pin badge if you got in, and something a little bit special for the number 1 slot. Ah, the glory. You'd cut this form out, fill it in and post it off, hoping to see your name in the next issue. Proper old school magazine stuff. Good times. This page right from the very first issue of N64 Magazine, April 97, proper blast from the past this is. It's all about the Nintendo hotline. Do you remember phoning them up? Supposedly they were the N64 gurus, helping you out when you got stuck. Sounds mad now when you can just look it up online, but back then it was the only option. This section is called You're Through to Nintendo, and then in massive orange letters, Problems. And guess what game all the problems are about? Yep, Super Mario 64. As if anything else even existed at the time. They've picked the top 10 questions they reckon people were asking. Like, how do you get that star behind Chain Chomp, though they called him Bow Wow here for some reason? Just give the post a good whack, apparently. Or the Red Switch Palace. Something about standing in the sunlight and looking up. Bit cryptic if you ask me. Getting out of the pyramid in course 8. Get a star. Or deliberately lose a life. Bit of a design flaw that, eh? The old mirror room, yeah, that confused pretty much everyone. Luigi, always getting the short straw. Only in Mario Kart 64 it seems. Not the actual Mario 64. Wooden posts in course 13, running around them gets you coins, how thrilling. And finally, Yoshi. You need to collect 120 stars just to see him. Flipping heck. And then apparently he tells you his news. Well, aren't we lucky? Then there's a bit explaining what the Nintendo hotline even is. Expert games players, they reckon, and a very strict selection process. Sounds a bit like they're recruiting for MI5. Open 7 days a week, 365 days a year, taking over 2,000 calls a day. Blimey. And there's the phone number, remember those premium rate numbers? Cost you a fortune if you were stuck for long. Still, it was all part of the N64 launch buzz, wasn't it? Backflips and Bowser-busting techniques. Bit over the top, lads, calm down. Issue 1, page 94. Takes you right back, doesn't it? This page depicts a classic hotline tips section from N64 Magazine back in April '97. Ah, remember those days? Before the internet was in every pocket and you had to actually phone a number for your cheat codes and gaming secrets. It's all about getting the edge in the latest N64 games. Shook us. First up, we've got Cruisin' USA. Seems like they're showing you how to unlock some extra cars, the ATV, school bus and police car, by holding down a bunch of buttons on the car select screen. Bit of a faff, but hey, who wouldn't want to race around in a school bus? They also mention flashing lights, which is a bit of a novelty, though probably not going to win you any races. Then, there's Killer Instinct Gold. Ah, Gargos, the big boss. They've got a cheat to play as him, which was always a big deal in fighting games back then. Pressing ZB, A, L, ZB and Start S sounds like a proper button-mashing combo. And apparently Gargos laughs when you get it right. Nice touch. They also mention a Sky Stage code, which sounds like a cool arena, and a special colors code for your fighters. All standard fighting game cheat fare, really. Nossa. Finally, we get to Super Mario 64. Now this is where it gets interesting. Immortality trick. Apparently, if you collect 1,000 coins from any of the Bowsers, good luck with that, Mario becomes immortal in a roundabout sort of way. Bit vague, isn't it? And then the kicker. It says he loses a life each time he eats a 1-up mushroom. That's properly bonkers. Sounds more like a curse than a cheat, doesn't it? And then there's an extra cap trick where you can supposedly get extra caps on Snowman's Land. Warping between trees and grabbing caps. Typical Mario weirdness. They even note the immortality trick is only tested on Japanese carts, and the extra cap trick on US carts. Classic import shenanigans back then. So yeah, classic hotline tips page. Gotta love the slightly cryptic descriptions and the promise of unlocking all sorts of hidden stuff. Makes you wonder how many people actually dialed that phone number back in '97 for these gems. Probably cost a fortune. This page from the very first issue of N64 Magazine takes us straight back to the hype surrounding the Nintendo 64 launch. It's the letters page, called Club 64, and it's clear people are chuffed to bits about finally getting their hands on the console. The letters are all pretty positive, bordering on gushing, to be honest. One bloke, Zohair Beg from South Harrow, reckons the N64 is kind of scary, because it's so radically different, and will change the world of video games forever. Bit dramatic, mate, but you could feel that excitement back then. He mentions Hexen 64, saying you should try that, which was a decent enough Doom-like game for the time, though maybe not world-changing. Then there's Andy Pierce from Pontefract, feeling a tiny bit ripped because he pre-ordered an American import, and now the UK version is out. He's a bit miffed about paying a premium, but admits it's worth it in the end. You know how it is, gotta have it first. Whoa! Brian Brown from Birmingham is raving about Perfect Striker by Konami. Remember that football game? He's saying it's better than any PlayStation or Saturn footy game. Strong words indeed. There's a screenshot showing it looks alright for the time, polygons and all. Ed, the editor, has a little sarcastic comment about Brian mentioning it, clearly not a big fan himself, or maybe just bitter about getting beaten in the office. Another letter talks about game cartridge size, and how amazing it is they fitted Super Mario 64 onto a 64 MBIT cartridge. It was quite a feat at the time, though looking back, cartridges feel a bit archaic now compared to discs or downloads, don't they? The page also has the address to write to the magazine, if you were inclined to send a letter back in '97. And it says, any letters printed win a prized N64 magazine badge. Ooh, fancy that. All in all, it's a nice snapshot of the initial buzz around the N64, full of the kind of over-the-top enthusiasm you get with new consoles. Good times, even if we were all maybe a bit easily impressed back then. This page is a right proper snapshot of the questions we were all pondering back in April '97 about the N64. Kicking off with the burning questions, Stephen Madley and Joe Runnacles are asking the important stuff like, will we see games like Space Hulk or Command & Conquer on the N64? The mag folks reckon Quake is a definite yes, Command & Conquer and Resident Evil are maybe, but Space Hulk and Need for Speed are a no-go. Apparently they're a bit old and forgotten already, cheeky sods. Someone's also wondering about a VR headset for the N64, which is quickly dismissed as a '90s fad that went nowhere. And there's the classic question about graphics. Are N64 games actually using its 3D power properly, or just doing pre-rendered stuff like other consoles? The mag reckons N64's real-time 3D is the business, better than pre-rendered rubbish. Then there's the big one, is there going to be a CD-ROM thingy for the N64? Yes indeed, they say, it's called the 64DD. And multiplayer gaming was clearly on everyone's minds. Is it worth getting more than 2 controllers for Mario Kart and Star Fox? Definitely, they reckon. Light gun games are also brought up, and the mag hopes they won't be as pants as the SNES Super Scope. Takal. Moving on to Japanese imports, someone's trying to get their head around playing US games on a Japanese N64, and getting the video output sorted. Turns out you can get adapters, and SCART is still the best for tele-hookup, naturally. Turok and Star Fox 64 release dates are also mentioned. Turok supposed to be out in Japan in March, and Star Fox 64 in April there, and June over here. Release dates for Wave Race 64, International Superstar Soccer 64, and Mario Kart 64 are given as mid-April, June and June respectively. Package deals with extra controllers are a no-go apparently, and the 64DD for Zelda 64. Don't hold your breath. The next bit is all about what readers want in the magazine itself. Dreyer Christian from Switzerland wants Z.Y. Nicholson, that's Zai, as a reviewer, and wants all the Killer Instinct Gold moves printed but not Mortal Kombat Trilogy because everyone knows them already apparently. Fair point. Leighton James is after interviews with Nintendo and other game companies, which sounds sensible. Richard Watkinson is banging on about how good the early N64 games are, like Super Mario 64 and Killer Instinct Gold, and reckons Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey is a good laugh too. Someone else wants Will Overton as art editor, reckons his style is proper Nintendo, and wants honest reviews, not just handing out 75% scores for duff games. Finally, there's a bit about Pilot Wings 64. Robert Kurd is loving the commentator in that game who says, "No Mrs. Beautiful. Wordu, when you nail a perfect landing." Sounds about right. And we finish off with Richard Watkinson again, going on about how early releases are great on the N64 and he used to go to Pembroke Dock on holiday, for some reason. All in all, a good read, gets you right back to the anticipation of the N64 days. This page from the first issue of N64 Magazine, right? Blimey, takes you back. It's the Club 64 inches letters page, where readers are having their say. Steve from Manchester kicks things off moaning about game scores, reckons 7,080% is decent, and if it's lower than 5% then the mag should just say so. Fair enough, Steve. Then there's a bit of a Barney about the magazine cover being unoriginal, apparently compared to some anime thing. Honestly, people moaned about everything back then. Another reader, Ian from Northampton, is well chuffed with his N64, reckons it'll see off the PlayStation and Saturn, a bold claim in '97. Someone in Guernsey is going on about Mario 64, and someone else wants a yellow control pad. Everyone wanted the funky coloured pads, didn't they? There's a high scores bit which is a laugh. Rupp from London's banging on about his Mario Kart 64 times, bragging about shaving seconds off and using Canopio Toad to us and you. Seems a bit sad now, but we were all obsessed with those times back in the day. Then there's a section called Dream On, where the N64 Magazine folks are pitching their dream games. Jonathan wants a World War I flight sim, something like Knights of the Sky updated, reckons the analog stick would be ace for biplanes. Will wants an action RPG, proper deep, stat changing the works, a bit like Time Commando on PC but set in different time periods. James, predictably, being a Doom fan, wants a 4-player split-screen Doom-alike, maybe Hexen. And Tim, bless him, wants a football management game J-League Perfect Striker style, with dodgy Premier Manager elements where you can hire an assassin. Bit extreme, Tim. Right at the bottom it's plugging sending in your dream game ideas to win an N64 badge. A badge! Those were the days. It's funny looking back at what we thought was cutting edge, proper retro gaming nostalgia this page is. This page depicts the directory section from the first issue of N64 Magazine, back in '97, eh? Crikey. Time flies. This was basically your guide to all the N64 games they'd got their mitts on. They've laid out how it all works, saying they'll cover the game's name, the publisher, whether it's an import from the US or Japan, a bit about what they thought of it, and any handy tips or cheats. Standard stuff for a game mag, really. Aye. Right at the top they've got this daft thing called Special Moth 64 inches. Looks like a bit of a joke, to be honest, probably some obscure import. Apparently it's from Supercarts, and ages away from being released in the UK, but they've slapped a 90% score on it. Cheeky sods. Reviewer FB seems to think it's mega addictive, and about game junkies. The tip is some nonsense about whispering to Belgium in an elephant's ear. Honestly, magazine humour back then, eh? Then we get to the proper games, starting with Pilot Wings 64. Nintendo published it, 50 quid, issue 1 review, 89%, from TW. They reckon it's split opinions a bit, being floaty and all that, but this 64-bit version is supposed to be better than the SNES one. Sounds like they thought it showed off the N64's potential. Tip about finding Birdman stars. Next up, Super Mario 64. 60 quid, Nintendo again, issue 1, and a whopping 96% from ZN, who I think they said to call Zai. No surprise it got a top score, mind you. Mario 64 was revolutionary. They're gushing about it being sublime and the greatest video game, which, yeah, it kind of was at the time. Loads of tips in the mag apparently, and the 20 most asked questions. Bet they were mostly about finding all those bloody stars. Shadows of the Empire is next, also 60 quid, and Nintendo, reviewed in issue 1, 78% from JA. Bit lower score this one. They mention different game styles but think it's not quite as good as the sum of its parts. Space battles are alright, but some Doom-style bits are lacking. Still got a Star Wars feel though, and better than Dark Forces on PC apparently. Tip about seeing the end sequence and challenge points. Warring Dog. Lastly, Turok. Dinosaur Hunter. Acclaim published it, bit pricier at 70 quid, issue 1 again, 90% from FB. Dinosaurs instead of demons from Doom, eh? Sounds alright. They're impressed with the graphics and weapons, reckon it shows off the N64 well, and is better than other consoles. Jumping tip and weapons guide mentioned. Down the side they've got a list of the reviewers and their initials. James Ashton, Marcus Hawkins, Will Overton, Jonathan Davies, Tim Weaver, and ZY Nicholson, that's Zai again. Explains who's behind the initials in the reviews then. Yeah, typical games directory page, giving you the lowdown on what was out for the shiny new N64 back in the day. Happy days. This page from an old N64 mag must be from around early 97. Looking at these games, it's all about import titles, stuff you probably couldn't easily get down your local high street, especially not back then. First up is Cruisin' USA. Remember seeing this in the arcades. Wasn't too bad for a laugh, but the reviewer here, JD, isn't overly impressed, calls it hardly earth-shattering stuff. Bit harsh maybe, but yeah, it wasn't Mario 64, was it? Apparently, the music's a bit pants, and the graphics don't push the N64 much, which is a fair cop. There's some cheat codes if you're stuck though. Bria. Next is King of Pro Baseball. Now this is proper Japanese import territory. Looks a bit, well, super deformed as they say, and cute. TW reviewing this one says it's entertaining enough if you can figure out the Japanese menus, which was always a pain, wasn't it? Slow runners apparently. Then we have The Glory of St. Andrews, a golf game. Now N64 wasn't exactly overflowing with golf games at this point, but this one sounds like a bit of a stinker. TW again calling it a hugely disappointing golfing debut with a ropey graphical engine and feeling a bit 16-bit. Ouch. Mahjong Master. That's a bit niche for the N64, isn't it? But there you go. WO reviewed it, says it's a decent version of Mahjong if you fancy it, even with weird Japlish intro screens. Mario Kart 64. Now this is more like it. 91% score. JAD is loving this one, and rightly so. All-time most loved games. Whole new world of 3D, yeah, this was the business back then. 4-player split screen was just amazing. Turbo start tip, and something about gold cups too. Nulsa Hazmeshu. J-League Perfect Striker, another Japanese one. Football game this time, from Konami, so you know it's probably decent. 89% from TW, calling it magical footballing sim. Breathtaking animation. Sounds like they're well impressed. Apparently it's coming to the UK as ISS 64 in June. Kick and Run tip mentioned. Killer Instinct Gold. Now this was a bit of a coin-op classic, wasn't it? ZN gives it 62%. Not amazing. Says it's a perfect conversion, but a bit old school and relying on combos. Wait for a better fighter, bit blunt. Fatality move mentioned. Finally, Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Oh dear. 34%. MH is not happy. Bored of Mortal Kombat? Barely changed. Says Tekken and Virtua Fighter have left it in the dust. Calls it the final straw. Awful sound. Unbelievably worse animation. Sounds like they really hated this one. Cheat for unlimited credits though if you really must. So yeah, a mixed bag of import games then. Some gold like Mario Kart, some less so, like Mortal Kombat. That was imports for you back then, you never quite knew what you were gonna get. This page depicts a directory section from what looks like an early N64 magazine, issue 1, blimey that takes me back. It kicks off with a look at NBA Hang Time. Midway of course were always good for arcade sports games, weren't they? ZY, the reviewer, calls it technically excellent and mentions the 2D players but great animation. but then pretty much says it's a bit samey, just running back and forth scoring baskets, and says he'd rather play football. Bit harsh maybe? But I guess compared to proper footy games on the PlayStation at the time, it might have felt a bit basic. Then there's Wave Race 64. Now this was something special back then. Nintendo themselves, UK release in April apparently. The reviewer's gushing about the waves and how realistic the jet skis bounce, and reckons it's a better racing game than Mario Kart 64. That's fighting talk. They mention a stunt mode, sounds cool, and a review and course guide in the next issue, typical magazine stuff. Next up is Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, again Midway, another arcade sports title, ice hockey, with violent collisions and fast pucks they say. Sounds like classic Midway again, not subtle but good for a laugh with mates, especially 4-player. Apparently you can mess with the options to change player appearances too. Finally for the games is Wonder Project J2 from Enix, a Japanese title, release unlikely in the UK it says. They're saying you need to be Japanese speaking or special to get into it, and even then it's not amazing. Guiding a robotic girl, trying to make her a real person, sounds a bit weird and maybe a bit too Japanese for most of us back then to be honest. There's a strange cheat mentioned involving Josette and 3D pudding, classic magazine random humor I suppose. Moving on, there's a numbers section which is all about UK game releases and companies. Apparently games released here have to be in English, which makes sense, and are distributed through either the Nintendo UK lot or other game publishers. They list a load of companies with phone numbers: Acclaim, BMG, Bullfrog, Codemasters, Eidos, Electronic Arts, Fox Interactive, Gamatech, Gremlin, GT Interactive, Hudson Soft, Infogrames, Interplay, JVC, Konami, Ocean, Psygnosis, Telstar, THE Games, THQ, TIM, Titus, Ubisoft and Virgin. Pretty much a who's who of publishers from back then. A good few of those are probably long gone now. There's a website of the month bit, and it's Nintendo Power's website. They say it's got official news and screenshots of N64 games but lacks detail, reviews, and tips. They mention it's slow because it's graphics intensive, which is a very 90s internet problem, isn't it? Then at the bottom there's a list of Nintendo related and unofficial websites and game company sites. Nintendo Power and Nintendo Japan official sites are there, along with Next Generation and Game Japan, and a few unofficial N64 sites like N64 Headquarters and N64 Gazette. Then there's a big list of game company websites, from Activision to Williams, Capcom, Crystal Dynamics, Data East, Eidos, Electronic Arts, Enix, Epic Mega Games, Gamatech, Graphics School, GT Interactive, GTE, Hudson, Human, Interplay, Konami Japan, Konami US, LucasArts, Microprose Midway, Mindscape, Multigen, Namco US, Namco Japan, Ocean, Paradigm, Playmates, Rambus, Raven, Shiny, Squaresoft, THQ, Ubisoft, Victokai, Virgin Westwood and Williams. Again, a massive list. Must have taken ages to type all those website addresses in back then. Shows how early days it all was, for game websites really, a proper directory of them in a magazine. Good times. This page, from a retro N64 magazine, is all about getting you to subscribe. It's issue 4 from April 97, so right when the N64 was still pretty new and exciting here in the UK. They're shouting about saving 33% on the cover price, which back then every penny counted as those N64 games weren't cheap. The cover of the mag itself shows Mario looking cheerful, and what looks like Turok, who was a bit of a big deal dinosaur hunter at the time. You can also see mentions of Mario Go Go, which I guess was Mario Kart 64, plus Wave Race 64 and Pilotwings 64. All launch window sort of titles if I recall correctly. They're promising reviews of upcoming games in the next issues, and they're reeling off some pretty big names. Star Fox 64, which everyone was buzzing about, Blast Corps from Rare, Zelda 64 Ocarina of Time, though they probably didn't know the full title, then Doom 64, and even Gambare Goemon 5, which was a bit more niche but cool if you were into that kind of thing. Pretty strong lineup to tempt you in. To subscribe, you could fill out the form for direct debit or check, or even use a Visa or Access card, remember those? Prices for UK, Europe and rest of the world are listed, and if filling forms wasn't your thing, you could actually phone or fax in your subscription. Faxing! Madness looking back on it. Or even email, which was still a bit novel for many back then. It's all a bit of a time capsule really, reminding you how things were done back in the day before everything was online. This page depicts a rather stylish, if I say so myself, shot of the Nintendo 64 console itself. It's all moody and black, with this kind of wireframe ghost of the console floating over it, a bit like they were trying to show off the inner workings or something technical. It's very 90s design, you know? For. It's issue 1 of the magazine, so it makes sense they'd put the console front and center. Back then, the N64 was the absolute hot ticket. Everyone was buzzing about it, especially after waiting so long after the Super Nintendo. We were all wondering if it would really live up to the hype, and seeing it presented like this in a new magazine, it definitely ramped up the anticipation. No games mentioned specifically on this page, it's more about the machine itself, which, fair enough, in the first issue you'd expect them to be showing off the goods, wouldn't you? It's got that big, chunky controller port area on the front, ready for your mates to plug in and join the GoldenEye battles later down the line, of course. Good times. This page, right, takes us back to the launch hype for the Nintendo 64. Lifting the lid, it says in big letters, very dramatic, eh? It's all about how they managed to cram so much power into that little grey box. They're asking how something so great can be squeezed into so small a box. Classic magazine headline stuff. The article starts off talking about how the N64 was expected to sell millions and be a big deal, like electricity, fire and the wheel bit over the top, but that's magazines for you. It talks about the technological jump the N64 was supposed to be, a step up the ladder from the SNES and NES, and comparing it to the Saturn and PlayStation, which were already out. They mention how normally consoles just got a bit better each time, faster graphics, more bit CD drives and all that jazz, but Nintendo went a different way with the N64, teaming up with Silicon Graphics. Remember Silicon Graphics? Proper fancy stuff. $1,000,000 workstations, not just for playing games, but for rich folks. The article suggests they somehow squeezed the power of a top-end workstation into the N64, and for less money than the other consoles. Nobody really believed the hype back then, did they? Thinking back to 1993 and Project Reality, they were making big promises, while Sega and Sony were starting to look like they were taking over with their 32-bit machines. Nintendo hadn't really shown anything comparable at that point. It's all building up the anticipation, you know, before we actually get to see what's inside. No game mentions or anything on this page, it's all about the console itself. This page of N64 Magazine, issue 1 it is, takes a look at the new Nintendo 64 console, breaking down all the bits and bobs of the machine itself. Right at the top, it's proclaiming the N64 as the first console that lets designers do basically anything, which is a bold claim, even for 97. They're on about how Shigeru Miyamoto finally got to make a proper 3D Mario game, Super Mario 64, without limitations. It mentions Pilotwings 64, showing off impressive 3D landscapes, saying it gives a true sense of flight for the first time in a game. Then there's talk of Zelda in 3D, finally getting away from just sprites, plus Star Fox 64 and Blast Corps, all sounding pretty action-packed and AWE inspiring. They reckon there's a real buzz around the N64, with folks who weren't even into consoles before getting excited about Super Mario 64. Moving on to the console itself, the page highlights the memory expansion slot under a hatch on top, where you could add extra RAM. Apparently it wasn't available yet, just a jumper puck bridging the gap, but the idea was you could boost the memory later for memory-hungry games, or maybe the 64DD add-on. Next up is the cartridge port, good old cartridges, with little pegs inside, and security chips to stop dodgy imports. Then the reset button, which is handy for skipping those long congratulations bits in Mario Kart 64 if you get fed up. The on/off switch is self-explanatory. And then there's the controller ports. 4 of them, chunky grey ones, twice as many as other machines apparently, which means 4-player Wayne Gretzky's hockey, or Mario Kart 64 sessions. They take inputs from controllers, and control packs and the jolt pack. Finally, there's a bit labelled growth on the controller cable. Turns out, it's a ferrite core, a requirement for European consoles to stop you from electrocution yourself with the buttons, or something. It also acts as a cable tensioner, if you trip over the wire, so you don't wreck the console. Hurrah! Down at the bottom there's a timeline starting in June 1993, mentioning the cancelled CD drive for the SNES, and how Nintendo decided to go with cartridges for the N64 to compete with Sega's Mega CD. They reckon they'll start properly on the new console, separate from the SNES, to launch in 95. August 1993 is next, saying Nintendo amazed the world by announcing Project Reality, which is a collaboration with Silicon Graphics, and they talk about a 32-bit machine with a built-in CD drive for under $200, targeting Sega's Saturn, which Sega had just revealed. So all very early days still, plenty of promise and speculation back then, before we actually got our hands on the beast. This page shows a breakdown of the Nintendo 64 console, focusing on the back and bottom of the machine. It's like having a good nosy around the console before you've even plugged it in. Up top they're pointing out the multi-out port, which is how you hook it up to your telly. They mention it does composite and video, which was pretty decent at the time, though they also mention the RF modulator, which for us Brits, was probably how most of us first hooked it up, using an aerial switchbox, saved a lot of faffing about behind the telly, I tell you. Then there's the AC adapter, a classic black brick, converting our 240 volts mains to power the N64, not that it used much juice, only about 15 watts they say, compared to an old light bulb. Down at the bottom they're highlighting the expansion port, which is a bit of a mystery at this point in '97, but they hint it's for expanding the console's capabilities, maybe the 64DD they're talking about. Intriguing stuff. The text also talks about the N64's graphics, boasting about the 3D graphics power of a £10,000 silicon graphics workstation, all for our little £250 console. A bit of marketing hype perhaps, but we were all excited about Jurassic Park-looking graphics in our living rooms. They mention silicon graphics hardware did the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, so that gives you an idea of the kind of punch they were trying to sell. Luring to Norsahap, there's a bit of industry chat too, mentioning Sony and Sega being worried about Nintendo's pricing. And they mention Project Reality, which was the N64's codename before they revealed the proper name, and how Rare and Williams were involved early on, working on Killer Instinct coin-ops, which was a big deal back then. Apparently DMA, Paradigm Simulations, Acclaim, Sierra, LucasArts and Electronic Arts were also signing up to make games for it. Seems like everyone was jumping on the N64 bandwagon. They finish off by saying, Project Reality is still a long way off, in May 1994, which is a bit of a funny time slip considering this is April '97, but I guess they're just looking back at the console's development history. This page depicts a spread from this N64 mag. Issue 1 it says. Right then they're banging on about reality immersion for the N64, claiming it's going to be like a £10,000 silicon graphics workstation in your living room. Bit of a stretch, innit? They go on about anti-aliasing, texture mapping, all that technical mumbo-jumbo about polygons and textures and whatnot. Apparently it's all happening automatically in the hardware. Unlike PC or PlayStation they sniff, so game developers can focus on making games that are actually fun, one would hope. Then there's a bit called What's in the Box, showing the console's insides, boasting about the R4300 iCPU and the 4 megabytes of RAM. 4 whole megs! They reckon it can shift data at a rate of 562.5 megabit per second. Sounds impressive on paper, doesn't it? They're saying games will be like Donkey Kong Country, but proper 3D. We'll believe it when we see it running smoothly. Down at the bottom they're having a right laugh at the Virtual Boy, calling it ill-fated. That's putting it nicely. And there's a strange picture of a snake. I've no idea why they put that there. Oh, and apparently back in July '94 it was called Ultra 64, and Donkey Kong Country is mentioned as an early offshoot. Right then, let's see if this reality immersion lives up to the hype, eh? This page dives into the N64 itself, getting all technical like. First off, it talks about the Reality coprocessor, which is apparently the geezer responsible for the 3D graphics. They bang on about it being 64-bit, and designed by Silicon Graphics, making out it's proper fancy. They say it can chuck out loads of polygons per second. Sounds impressive, I suppose, though back then we just wanted games to look good, didn't we? Aki. Then there's a big section on carts, meaning cartridges obviously. It's all about Nintendo sticking with cartridges rather than going down the CD route like PlayStation. Apparently, this was a right headache for them, trying to decide what to do. They mention that cartridges are more expensive to make than CDs but quicker to load. No. Loading please wait. Nonsense. They also reckon cartridges are harder to copy, which would please Nintendo, and they say you can save game positions directly onto them without memory cards, which is handy. They mention games like Pilot Wings 64 being squeezed onto relatively small carts, less than 7 megabits they reckon. Blimey. And there's talk of some data decompression magic going on to fit even more in. They also hint at the 64D drive coming along if you need even more space, which we all knew was coming eventually. There's an insider cart bit which goes into the technical stuff like ROM and save game chips. Standard N64 carts are supposed to be 64 megabits, with 128 megabits ones on the horizon. For saving games they've moved on from batteries to EEPROM, which is supposed to be more sophisticated, good for saving those Mario Kart Ghost data, apparently, something CDs can't do. Then a little box on the reset switch, just saying what it does resets the game like switching the console off and on again. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff. Down at the bottom, there's a timeline of news bits. Back in November '94, Sega launched the Saturn, nearly a year before the Ultra 64 was due. They said no Ultra 64 games had been seen then. Then in January '95, Silicon Graphics said their chips were done, and the Ultra 64 was on track for the end of the year. But by May 95, bad news, it was delayed until December in Japan, and even later for the US and Europe. They reckon the delay was down to software, and Nintendo's own development teams being behind schedule. A costly delay apparently. August 95, and they're dropping hints about the revolutionary controller, saying it will give more control than ever before. Right, we'll see about that. This page depicts a feature on the new Nintendo 64 controller, ripped straight from the first issue of N64 Magazine, back in April 97 if you can believe it. It's titled Taking Control, and they're gushing about how Nintendo always leads the way with controllers. Remember the NES and the SNES shoulder buttons? They reckon this analog stick is a huge leap forward. They go through all the buttons. L and R are like the SNES, Z trigger is for rockets in Pilotwings, photos too, and power-ups in Mario Kart. Sounds a bit fiddly to use with the stick at the same time apparently. D-pad. Standard directional stuff, like the SNES, good for Quake 64, but they think you'll be using the analog stick more. Controller pack slot for saving your high scores, and they mention the Jolt pack, and a light gun, remember those rumors? The joystick, or analog stick as we call it now, is the big innovation, mushroom-shaped, 360 degrees. They call it innocuous looking. Apparently Mario tiptoes, jogs, runs and sprints depending on how far you push it, smooth turns in Pilotwings, dinosaur aiming in Turok, ambitious stuff. A and B buttons are just your standard fire buttons. Nothing to write home about. The C buttons are for camera control in Mario 64 and Pilotwings, moving around in Turok, and something to do with Wayne Gretzky and Perfect Striker sound a bit tacked on to me for those games. They mention colored controllers, red, blue, green, yellow, black, and a special Mario Kart grey and black one. Then a timeline of the N64 launch. November 95, Ultra 64 shown in Japan, games not finished, delayed to April. February 96, more delays, June in Japan, September US, no Euro date yet, Super Mario 64 hype building. June 96, Japan launch, massive sales, everyone gets Super Mario 64 bundled in, Pilotwings and Shogi Chess are the only other games at launch, talk about limited choice. September 96, US launch, sells out. March 97, Europe finally gets it, £250. Sells out but only 20,000 made it to the UK initially, typical. There's a picture of the controller, and Mario riding Yoshi. It all felt pretty exciting at the time, didn't it? Looking back, some of it is a bit much, but hey, it was a new console. This page depicts an article in N64 Magazine, back in April 97 it was, about playing import games on your brand new Nintendo 64. Right, because, let's be honest, the UK launch was a bit of a joke, wasn't it? We got the console, but bugger all games. America and Japan had been enjoying Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64 for ages, and we were stuck waiting. Mario Kart 64 was out in Japan in December, and the US in February, but Europe? June apparently. June! So of course we were all looking at importing. The article goes through the hassle of getting Japanese or US N64s to work over here in the UK. First off, you needed a fancy telly that could handle NTSC, not just our standard PAL. Then there's the power supply, needing a step-down transformer because their voltage is different. Sounds like a right faff, doesn't it? Apparently imported N64s come with 3 phono outputs, video, and 2 audio, which is handy. And if you've got S-video on your telly, even better picture, apparently. Warrington no. Warrington no. Warrington no. Then there's the cartridge lockout, typical Nintendo, eh? They made it so you couldn't just pop in any old import game. But, fear not, ZY, bless him, tells us how to get around it. You can either get a bridge adapter, bit pricey, or, if you're brave, you can open up your console and fiddle about inside. They even show you how to take out this plastic rail inside with pegs on it. Says you can unscrew it or even hacksaw the pegs off. Madness. Void your warranty, mind you, and they're not responsible if you break your shiny new console. Cheeky. The what cart bit is interesting. Apparently American and Japanese carts look the same but aren't quite. American carts are supposed to be electrically the same as Japanese ones though. Japanese carts have a slightly different case to stop imports, but a simple modification makes them work. Right. Hong Kong carts are a bit weird. American code but Japanese style cases. And then UK carts are different again, with different security chips. So basically a right old mess. Jabour. There are pictures of cartridges, looks like Gretzky 3D hockey on an American cart, Pilotwings 64 on a Japanese one, and Super Mario 64 on a UK cart. Oh, and a power transformer and someone fiddling with the inside of an N64 with a screwdriver. Mad lads. Says next month they're interviewing Shigeru Miyamoto, the father of Mario no less. Must be a big issue then. April 97, yeah, good times. trying to get our hands on any games we could while we waited for the proper UK releases. This page is an advert, a competition really, from the very first issue of N64 Magazine, back in April '97. Blimey, time flies. It's all about winning an N64, and it looks like Mario Kart 64 is the game they are showing off. Remember the hype for that console? Absolutely massive. And Mario Kart 64, well, that was the game everyone was desperate to play. 4-player split-screen madness? Nothing quite like it back then, even if looking back now, those graphics are a bit chunky, aren't they? Rassic. They've got a bunch of lads here, gathered around a telly playing. Looks like they are having a right laugh. You can see snippets of gameplay in little boxes below, with the sort of things you'd hear shouted across the room during a Mario Kart session. Curse you and your banana antics. Classic Mario Kart frustration. Gah! This game is rubbish! Yeah, right. No one ever really thought Mario Kart was rubbish, even when they were losing. Tim enjoys a rare victory. There's always one Tim, isn't there? And the last one. Fire that shell and you're dead, son. Threatening your mates with red shells. Standard procedure. The prize, or at least what they are showing as the prize, is not just the console but the whole setup: big screen, 4 controllers, even a bag of Walker's crisps. Bit cheeky saying you can't have us, for example, about the blokes playing, but hey, it's an advert, gotta be a bit jokey. It's all very of the time, really. Just reminds you of how exciting the N64 launch was, and how everyone wanted to get their hands on Mario Kart 64 for those multiplayer battles. Good times. This page is an advert, really, for a competition in the very first issue of N64 Magazine, back in April '97. Crikey, that's a while ago now, isn't it? It's called the Ultimate Nintendo 64 Evening In. Blimey, they were really pushing the boat out. The idea was that one lucky reader would win a full-on N64 setup to fill their bedroom. I'm talking about a Nintendo 64 console, of course, a massive telly, which back then probably wasn't even that massive by today's standards. 4 special N64 chairs, those director-style ones you used to see, and piles of other goodies. Crisps and drinks are mentioned. Essential for a proper gaming sesh, of course. The tone of the article is proper enthusiastic, like they're really excited about the N64, saying it's the most exciting thing in video games since Pong. Bit much maybe, but we were all pretty hyped back then, weren't we? They bang on about 4 players being able to play at once, which was a big deal at the time. They were giving away 4 joypads, which is what we called controllers back then, and even a telly big enough for 4-player Mario Kart. Good times. To win this truckload of goodies, you had to answer 5 questions, like a proper competition entry form. Let's have a look at these questions then, see if I remember the answers. Warringtons. Question 1 is, what day of the week was the Nintendo 64 released in Japan? Tricky one to remember off the top of my head. Question 2. Which MK character will star in Mortal Kombat Mythologies? Now that's a bit more my cup of tea. I vaguely remember hearing about that game. Probably Sub-Zero, wasn't it? Question 3 is a bit more specific. What's Jonathan's fastest time attack time on Mario Circuit? This Jonathan must be someone from the magazine then, probably a good player. Right, Mario Circuit on Mario Kart 64, gotta remember that track. Question 4 is name 2 teams in Japan's J-League. Footy question, not my strong suit, but I suppose someone into their Japanese football might know that. Finally, question 5. How many stars are needed to complete Super Mario 64? Now that's a classic, everyone knew that one, didn't they? Well, everyone who actually played it, that is. Kichi. Right at the bottom it says SEND-IT2. The Mad as a Lorry Compo. N64 Magazine. Mad as a Lorry. Typical magazine competition name. Very British. And the closing date to enter was Tuesday, May 13th, 1997. So yeah, proper blast from the past this page. Takes me right back to the early days of the N64 hype. This page depicts a spread from N64 Magazine, issue 2, plugging what's inside, and also has an index for issue 1 to get you hooked in. Tussatris. The big headline is Blast Core. They're calling it Nintendo's next masterpiece, and promising a full review in this issue. Reckons it's going to be all about bulldozing things and massive explosions. Sounds right up my street, if a bit over the top. Typical magazine hype, eh? Then there's Wave Race 64. They're doing a deep dive into the UK version. Reckon they'll tell you everything to get the most out of it. Water racing game, remember those? Seemed alright at the time. Warpy. In the import arena section, they're looking ahead to some games coming over from Japan and the US. Doom 64 inches is mentioned, saying it looked great in an early version. Might be worth keeping an eye on that one. Blade and Barrel is some shooter, and there's also baseball and racing games mentioned. Probably not setting the world on fire, but hey, imports were always a bit of a gamble, weren't they? FIFA 64 inches is previewed, wondering if it can beat Konami's football game. International Superstar Soccer 64. which they're calling J-League Perfect Striker for some reason, probably some fancy Japanese name thing. Football games were always a big deal. For strategy guides, they've got Super Mario 64, with tips from someone called ZY, pronounced Zai, apparently, to get 70 stars quickly. 70 stars, eh? Show off. And Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, with key and weapon locations. Dinosaurs and guns, that was a thing for a while, wasn't it? Shadows of the Empire is also mentioned, saying James will be revealing challenge point locations next month. Star Wars game, that was probably quite exciting back then, though it's probably aged a bit now if I'm honest. True. And on the right there's an index for issue 1. Blimey, loads of games in that first issue. Cruisin' USA, Killer Instinct Gold, Mario Kart 64, Pilot Wings 64, Star Fox 64 inches Future Look, and even Zelda 64 inches Future Look, plus loads of others like Dynamite Soccer, Go Go, Troublemakers, Mission Impossible, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, NBA Hangtime, and Super Mario 64 inches review itself, so they reviewed it in issue 1 and are doing tips in issue 2. Bit odd. There's previews for games like FIFA 64, Multi Racing Championship, Rev Limit, Robotech, Crystal Dreams, Silicon Valley, Sonic Wings Assault, Top Gear Rally, Yoshi's Island, and import reviews like Cruisin' USA, Glory of St. Andrews, J-League Perfect Striker, Killer Instinct Gold, King of Pro Baseball, Mahjong Master, Mario Kart 64, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, NBA Hangtime, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, and Wonder Project J2. Phew, they were really packing it in back then, weren't they? Plus some bits and bobs like Cassette Case, Club 64, 64DD News, N64 UK launch, and N64 lifting the lid. Seems like they covered pretty much everything going on with the N64 at the time.